3,000 years ago, the most powerful empire on Earth faced 10 impossible disasters that shattered everything they believed about reality. Egypt's god-king Pharaoh commanded armies, controlled the Nile, and ruled like a living deity. Then a shepherd named Moses arrived with demands that triggered supernatural catastrophes no science can explain. Rivers turned to blood, darkness you could touch, death that chose its victims with surgical precision. These weren't just biblical stories. They're documented events that brought the ancient world's greatest superpower to its knees. What really happened during those terrifying months that changed human history forever? The throne room of Ramesses gleamed with Nubian gold, its walls breathing with the accumulated power of 3 millennia. Light fell through clear-story windows to strike the polished granite floors, where provincial governors had prostrated themselves since dawn, their foreheads pressed to stone that held the imprint of countless supplications. The hieroglyphs carved into every surface told the same story in endless variation. Egypt triumphant, Egypt eternal, Egypt blessed by gods whose favor flowed like the Nile itself through channels carved by divine will. That morning, the god-king felt the weight of empire, pressing against his ribs with unfamiliar insistence. 23 years he had ruled from Memphis to the cataracts. 23 floods had come and gone beneath his divine oversight. 23 seasons of tribute had filled the royal treasuries, until gold seemed as common as river sand. The palace itself stood as testimony to his glory, corridors that stretched like the passages of eternity, gardens where lions dozed in the shade of sycamores brought from the ends of the earth, workshops where master craftsmen shaped precious metals into forms that would outlive the stars themselves. But empires, like mortals, carried within their magnificence the seeds of their own unraveling. The morning reports lay before him on cedar tablets inlaid with ivory and precious stones, each character incised with the precision that marked the world's oldest bureaucracy. Population figures from the Delta provinces, harvest projections, military dispatches from border commanders who wrote their assessments in the clipped phrases of men who had learned that brevity pleased kings more than eloquence. Standard administrative fare, the daily bread of imperial governance. Yet something in the patterns emerging from these routine communications had begun to disturb his sleep. What was once a tolerable annoyance had become, in the Hebrews, something far larger and more menacing. In the northeastern provinces, where the great river split into the 1,000 channels that made Egypt the garden of the world, entire cities now echoed with voices speaking not Egyptian, but the harsh consonants of that Asiatic tongue. The descendants of Jacob had carried with them across Sinai generations ago. They worked, indeed, they worked with an efficiency that his overseers praised in reports that came tinged with admiration and unease in equal measure. Their brickworks produced materials of exceptional quality. Their metalworking surpassed traditional Egyptian standards. Their knowledge of animal husbandry had improved the kingdom's herds beyond all previous achievement. Even so, they existed side by side, bound together only by proximity, like oil forever refusing water's embrace. The god-king rose from the lion throne and moved to the great window that overlooked his newest monument, a forest of columns that would dwarf even Karnak's hyperstyle hall when complete. Below, Hebrew work gangs moved with coordinated precision, their voices calling instructions in Egyptian, while their songs between tasks carried melodies that spoke of another land, another promise, another allegiance that lay deeper than any contract written on papyrus or carved in stone. Ramesses watched them labor under the desert sun, their backs bent beneath blocks of limestone that had been quarried in the cliffs across the river, and ferried to this site by crews who understood their work as participation in something larger than mere construction. These monuments would stand when the current dynasty had passed into memory, when languages now spoken had become hieroglyphs that future scribes would struggle to decipher, when the very shape of the coastline had shifted beneath the patient pressure of wind and water. But would they stand as testimony to Egyptian glory, or as monuments built by a people whose hearts belonged elsewhere? The royal astronomer had mentioned disturbing patterns in his most recent observations, stars appearing where none had been recorded in the ancient charts, planets moving through houses that promised disruption rather than continuity. The sacred ibis had altered their migration routes, arriving later than the calculations predicted and departing before the ceremonies that honored their celestial significance could be properly completed. Minor deviations, perhaps. But the cosmos operated according to principles that made no distinction between minor and major. Every deviation from established pattern suggested forces at work that transcended ordinary human understanding. In the palace kitchens, Hebrew servants prepared the royal meals with the same skill they had displayed for generations, their knowledge of spices and preservation techniques making them invaluable to the complex household that sustained the divine pharaoh's earthly manifestation. In the royal workshops, Hebrew artisans crafted furniture and jewelry that would grace the tombs of nobles who trusted their afterlife comfort to hands guided by foreign traditions. In the great library, Hebrew scribes copied texts with calligraphy that equaled anything produced by native Egyptians, their fingers moving across papyrus with the practiced ease of those who had learned their letters in childhood. Still, when the day's work was done, servants and artisans and scribes alike returned to their homes, filling them with songs for their children. Songs not of Egypt, but of a God unseen, untouchable, and absent from every temple in the land he claimed as his. The pharaoh had consulted his chief magicians about this peculiar theology. Janus and Jambres, those brothers whose knowledge of the hidden arts made them valuable counselors in matters where ordinary wisdom proved insufficient, had described Hebrew religious practices with the careful precision of scholars who understood that knowledge could be dangerous as well as useful. Their invisible God demanded exclusive devotion, they reported, a theological position that struck at the very heart of Egyptian religious understanding, which had always shown remarkable flexibility in incorporating useful foreign deities into the established pantheon. Syrian storm gods became aspects of Set when political alliance required such theological diplomacy. Nubian lion deities merged with Sekhmet when conquest made their worship strategically advantageous. Mesopotamian fertility goddesses found places within Isis's expanding domain when trade relationships made cultural synthesis profitable. The Egyptian way was absorption, adaptation, the gentle transformation of foreign elements into familiar forms that strengthened rather than threatened the cosmic order that had sustained the kingdom since the first dynasty. But a god who refused such accommodation represented something unprecedented in Egyptian experience, a theological challenge that could not be managed through the usual methods of priestly statecraft. The afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, transforming the throne room into a furnace of reflected light that seemed to emanate from the divine essence of the man who bore responsibility for maintaining the cosmic balance that kept chaos at bay. Outside, the construction continued with rhythms that had become familiar as the sound of his own heartbeat. Hebrew voices coordinated the placement of blocks that would proclaim his glory to generations yet unborn, their efficiency a testament to skills that served Egyptian purposes, while their loyalty remained anchored to promises that had nothing to do with Egypt's eternal destiny. Rameses felt the pulse of empire beneath his feet, the great machine of administration and ritual, agriculture and warfare, art and scholarship that had sustained civilization longer than any other human achievement. Yet for the first time since assuming the divine crown, he wondered whether that pulse had begun to beat with irregular rhythms that suggested disturbances too deep for ordinary remedies. In the Delta workshops, Hebrew craftsmen shaped gold and silver into forms that would adorn temples dedicated to gods they did not worship. In the palace gardens, Hebrew gardeners tended exotic plants that would bloom in honor of festivals they did not celebrate. In the royal chambers, Hebrew servants prepared the king's rest, according to protocols that maintained the sacred order they did not acknowledge. And somewhere in the vast network of canals and cities, monuments and temples that constituted the Egyptian world, forces were gathering that would soon test whether 3 millennia of divine kingship could withstand challenges that came not from barbarian armies or natural disasters, but from ideas that acknowledged no compromise, no shared authority, no peaceful coexistence with powers that claimed dominion over the same cosmic territory. The weathered shepherd, who would soon approach the palace gates, carried with him more than a message from the Hebrew God. He bore the seeds of a confrontation that would determine whether Egypt's eternal glory could endure the collision with another eternity that recognized no Egyptian precedents, no pharaonic privilege, no divine authority except its own. Dawn over Memphis arrived not with its customary glory, but with an unease that fishermen could taste on their tongues before they understood what their eyes were seeing. The sacred river, that arterial lifeline which had pulsed with Egypt's heartbeat since the first pharaoh unified the two lands, flowed with the color and consistency of something that belonged not in waterways, but in the veins of dying men. Khemwaset stood waist-deep in what had been the Nile's life-giving current at sunrise, his fishing nets now tangled with something that resembled water only in its liquid state. The substance that lapped against his thighs felt warm against his skin, carrying a metallic tang that made his stomach clench with primitive revulsion. Around him, the pre-dawn mist rose not with the sweet breath of river moisture, but with vapors that spoke of slaughter on an incomprehensible scale. The transformation had occurred between one breath and the next, as if some cosmic hand had reached down to squeeze Egypt's throat until blood flowed instead of water. Fish floated belly up in their thousands, their silver scales dulled to the grey of old pewter. Their gills flared in permanent expressions of suffocation. The proud herons that had fished these shallows since time immemorial wheeled overhead in confusion, their harsh cries echoing across water that no longer reflected sky, but held only the deep crimson of spilled life. In the temple of Khnum at Elephantine, where the ram-headed god was said to control the Nile's annual flood, priests discovered their sacred pools transformed into something that mocked every ritual they had ever performed. The lustration basins that had purified generations of worshippers now contained liquid that defiled rather than cleansed, waters that promised contamination instead of spiritual renewal. The high priest, a man whose grandfather had served in these same chambers, stood before the altar where the god's statue gazed with unseeing eyes at offerings that could no longer be properly blessed. The sacred bark of Khnum, carved from cedar that had been seasoned in temple incense for 7 years, rocked gently in a harbor that resembled nothing so much as the flooded chambers of an abattoir. Its gold leaf caught the morning light and threw it back as reflections that shimmered red across waters where no reflection should have been possible, where light itself seemed corrupted by contact with liquid that had forgotten its proper nature. Word of the catastrophe spread through the kingdom with the swift efficiency that marked Egyptian administration at its finest and its most desperate. Royal messengers galloped along roads that paralleled the river, their horses shying from water sources that should have provided refreshment but now offered only revulsion. The reports they carried grew more dire with each mile. At Thebes, the great temples found their sacred lakes transformed. At Abydos, the pools where pilgrims bathed before approaching Osiris's shrine had become liquid that no one dared touch. Even the distant cataracts, where the river thundered over granite rocks worn smooth by millennia of passage, now fell with the sound of blood striking stone. In the palace workshops, craftsmen accustomed to using river water in their most delicate processes discovered that the clay for pottery cracked when mixed with the contaminated liquid, that dyes ran in patterns that spelled out no known hieroglyph, that metals tarnished when quenched in water, that had forgotten how to be merely water. The royal brewers, whose beer sustained both palace and temple, found their vats producing beverages that resembled nothing so much as the wine used in funeral rites. Dark, bitter, speaking of endings rather than sustenance. The irrigation channels that formed Egypt's agricultural circulatory system carried the contamination deep into the delta's fertile heart. Farmers who had risen before dawn to open the sluices that watered their fields discovered streams that would kill rather than nourish, channels that spread death instead of life across soil that had known only abundance since the first seeds were planted in Nile mud. The great shadows, those engineering marvels that lifted rivers' current to field through the leverage of weighted arms, now served only to distribute liquid that made the earth itself recoil. In the Hebrew quarter of Goshen, however, something else entirely was occurring. The wells that served the foreign population continued to flow with water that remained clear as mountain streams, cold as winter mornings, sweet as honey from combs blessed by gods whose names the Egyptians did not know. Hebrew women drew from these sources without fear. Their children drank without hesitation. Their livestock grazed beside pools that reflected sky and cloud with perfect clarity. The boundary between Egyptian contamination and Hebrew purity ran sharp as a bronze blade across the landscape, marking territories that seemed to exist in different realities, despite sharing the same geographical space. Egyptian observers who witnessed this phenomenon reported their findings with the careful precision of scribes, who understood that accurate record-keeping might be their only protection against accusations of either incompetence or treason. The division between corrupted and pure water followed no natural law they could identify, not elevation or soil type, not proximity to the main river or distance from its banks, not any factor that their most learned geographers could explain through reference to established principles of hydraulic engineering. Merchants who had built their prosperity on Nile transport discovered their vessels trapped in harbors where the water was too foul to support commerce, too contaminated to sustain the crews who might have attempted desperate voyages to trading partners in distant lands. The grain fleets that once spread Egypt's bounty abroad now sat useless at their moorings, their supplies spoiled, their throats unquenched, their journeys ruined by the very element once entrusted to serve mankind. Temple astronomers consulted charts that recorded celestial events stretching back 3,000 years, searching for precedents that might explain the river's transformation through reference to cosmic cycles they had studied since childhood. They found oblique references to times when the Nile ran red with silt from distant storms, occasions when upstream conflicts had filled the water with the detritus of war, periods when unusual flooding had disturbed sediments that normally remained hidden beneath the riverbed. But none of their records described anything resembling this complete alteration of water's essential nature. This transformation of life's source into something that belonged more to the realm of nightmares than natural phenomena. The God King himself stood on the palace balcony that overlooked the harbour, where royal barges had once reflected his divine glory, in waters that served as mirrors worthy of pharaonic majesty. Where once the currents shone, there now lay a black gleam that consumed brightness rather than returning it, giving back no image of earth or sky. The vessels that had carried him in triumph to ceremonies throughout the kingdom rocked gently at anchor in a harbour that resembled nothing so much as a lake of blood drawn from the veins of the earth itself. Below, palace servants attempted to maintain their usual routines, despite the contamination that had invaded every aspect of daily life. They drew water from the few wells that remained pure, distant sources high in the cliffs above the floodplain, springs that emerged from rock formations old enough to remember when the river had been merely water. These precious reserves were rationed with care that exceeded even the precautions taken during the worst famines in Egyptian history, each drop measured and allocated according to protocols that the royal household had never needed to develop until this morning. In the royal kitchen, cooks, accustomed to preparing elaborate feasts, discovered that even the most skilled preparation could not disguise the taste of meals prepared with contaminated water. Bread baked with the river's offering emerged from ovens with a color that suggested corruption rather than nourishment, a texture that spoke of decay rather than sustenance. Wine diluted with the transformed liquid acquired flavors that reminded those who tasted it of funeral offerings, of libations poured for the dead rather than celebrations of the living. The contamination spread beyond the physical realm into the spiritual landscape that gave Egyptian civilization its deepest meaning. Priests found themselves unable to perform the lustrations that purified them for service in the god's presence, the ritual washing that transformed mortal men into worthy servants of immortal powers, the daily ceremonies that maintained cosmic order, the offerings that fed the gods, the prayers that secured divine favor, the complex liturgies that kept chaos at bay, all required pure water for their proper completion. Without these rituals, performed correctly and continuously since the founding of the first dynasty, how long could Egypt maintain the cosmic balance that had sustained civilization for 3 millennia? How long could the gods be expected to protect a kingdom whose priests could no longer approach their altars in states of ritual purity? How long could mortal and divine realms maintain their proper relationship when the element that connected them had been transformed into something that defiled rather than sanctified? As the sun climbed toward its zenith, transforming the corrupted river into a sheet of liquid metal that hurt to look upon directly, messengers continued to arrive with reports from throughout the kingdom. The contamination was complete, total, absolute. Every branch of the great river, every canal that carried its waters, every pool that had been filled from its abundance, now contained only liquid that resembled blood more than water. Yet in Goshen, in that corner of Egypt where the descendants of Jacob maintained their separate existence, wells continued to flow with water that remained pure as the morning of creation, clear as the promises their invisible God had made to ancestors, whose names echoed in songs sung in a language that acknowledged no pharaonic authority. The first plague had begun, and with it, the cosmic trial that would determine whether Egypt's ancient glory could withstand the challenge of powers that recognized no earthly sovereignty, no divine authority except their own, no compromise with forces that claimed dominion over the same territories where pharaohs had ruled as gods since the world was young. Sunset brought with it a living tsunami of frogs, creatures that emerged from the corrupted Nile in numbers that defied both counting and comprehension. These were not the small amphibians that had always shared Egypt's waterways with fishermen and farmers, but massive specimens as large as dinner plates, their bodies swollen with supernatural vitality, their voices raised in a chorus that drowned out every other sound from Memphis to the cataracts. Heket, the frog goddess whose blessing had ensured fertility throughout Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, now seemed to mock her own worshippers through this overwhelming abundance of her sacred symbols. In every temple where her image smiled benevolently from painted walls, in every shrine where mothers had prayed for children and farmers had sought abundant harvests, the divine patroness appeared to have answered all petitions at once with a generosity that bordered on cosmic madness. The transformation began as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades that matched the river's contaminated hue. From pools and streams, from irrigation channels and sacred lakes, from every place where water met earth throughout the two lands, they came in waves that rolled across the landscape like floods animated by their own purpose. Green bodies glistened in the dying light as multitudes beyond number surged from their aquatic birthplaces toward destinations that seemed chosen by intelligence far exceeding any natural instinct. In the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, priests discovered their sacred pools transformed into breeding grounds that teemed with webbed invaders whose croaking voices made prayer impossible. The ritual specialists who had maintained daily ceremonies for decades found themselves unable to approach altars, now occupied by creatures whose presence should have been welcomed as signs of divine favor, but instead felt like accusations written in living flesh. These holy men, trained from childhood in the precise liturgies that kept chaos at bay, stood helpless before manifestations of their own goddess that had somehow become agents of disruption rather than blessing. Each morning, as the servants performed the ancient routines of purification laid down in the first dynasty, they came upon amphibians crowding every niche touched by dampness. In the pharaoh's private bathroom, where ritual ablutions prepared the god king for his daily transformation from sleeping mortal to divine ruler, spawn of Heket filled the ceremonial basin with bodies that pulsed in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat that acknowledged no earthly authority. The golden fixtures that had reflected pharaonic majesty now served as perches for creatures whose bulging eyes seemed to mock the very concept of royal dignity. Where once the palace kitchens crafted perfection for divine tables, now a chorus of frogs filled every pot and jar, turning sacred preparation into farce. Bread dough rose with the movements of creatures that had somehow penetrated even sealed containers, their webbed feet leaving tracks in preparations that had been intended for the pharaoh's table. Wine vessels that had been decanted with reverent care now contained beverages that moved with independent life, their contents transformed into something that belonged more to swamp than cellar. In the queen's chambers, where royal consorts had maintained the beauty that made them worthy companions for living gods, amphibians occupied cosmetic jars filled with precious oils imported from the ends of the earth. Mirrors that had reflected faces painted with kohl, brought from Nubia, and rouge, crafted from cinnabar, mined in distant mountains, now showed only the alien expressions of creatures whose presence turned luxury into grotesque comedy. Even the royal bed, carved from ebony and inlaid with gold leaf beaten thinner than butterfly wings, became a resting place for visitors whose moist skin left marks on linens that had been woven from fibers softer than clouds. The infestation penetrated beyond physical spaces into the spiritual architecture that gave the kingdom its deepest meaning. Sanctuaries, where the fertility deity had received offerings designed to ensure abundant harvests, now overflowed with evidence of that abundance taken to extremes that suggested divine displeasure rather than blessing. Sacred attendants found themselves unable to perform the lustrations that prepared them for service in divine presence. Their ritual washing interrupted by creatures that emerged from purification basins, with the persistence of accusers who would not be dismissed. In the great library at Alexandria, where scribes preserved the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years in hieroglyphs, carved on materials that would outlast the stars themselves, green masses of living flesh invaded scroll cases and papyrus collections with systematic thoroughness. Documents that recorded the names and attributes of every deity in the vast pantheon became unreadable beneath layers of amphibians whose presence seemed to comment sarcastically on theological traditions that had never anticipated this form of divine communication. Temple astronomers who consulted star charts to determine the proper timing for religious festivals discovered their instruments occupied by creatures whose moist touch tarnished bronze and corroded gold with supernatural efficiency. The careful calculations that aligned earthly ceremonies with celestial events became impossible when observation platforms teemed with visitors whose croaking drowned out the subtle music of the spheres that trained ears could normally detect, on clear nights when atmospheric conditions permitted communion between mortal and cosmic consciousness. Within the smithies of the palace, where gold and silver were meant to be fashioned into adornments for the honored dead, frogs infested the very furnaces, corrupting molten blends and reducing the patient labors of master craftsmen to maddening futility. Gold leaf cracked when applied to surfaces where webbed feet had left invisible traces. Silver tarnished in patterns that spelled out no recognizable hieroglyph. Bronze developed stains that resembled nothing in any metallurgical tradition preserved in guild archives. The divine household found itself besieged by manifestations of their own theological system, taken to logical conclusions that exceeded all reasonable boundaries. In the royal nursery, where future pharaohs would learn their first lessons about divine authority and cosmic responsibility, croaking multitudes filled cradles carved from cedar, blessed by priests who had spoken every appropriate prayer and performed every necessary ritual to ensure royal infants would be protected from supernatural interference that might threaten dynastic succession. Once testaments to the empire's breadth, the royal gardens of exotic growth became arenas where frogs intruded upon every corner, diverting eyes from the careful designs of their keepers. Lotus pools that had symbolized the primordial waters from which all creation emerged now hosted visitors whose numbers transformed symbolic representation into literal reality that overwhelmed aesthetic appreciation through sheer biological excess. Sycamores that had provided shade for royal meditation became perches for creatures whose constant vocalization made contemplative silence impossible. The cosmic trial that had begun with water transformed into blood now continued through abundance that mocked the very concept of divine blessing. By providing too much of what had been requested through centuries of faithful worship, prayers for fertility had been answered with a completeness that demonstrated either divine generosity beyond mortal comprehension or supernatural displeasure, expressed through irony that transcended human understanding of appropriate divine response to proper ritual observance. Meanwhile, in Goshen, the children of Jacob lived out their routines in peace, spared from the visitations that forced Egyptians into ceaseless adaptation. Their wells remained clear, their homes remained free from amphibian invasion. Their children played in courtyards where no croaking voices interrupted conversations, conducted in that harsh tongue their ancestors had carried across Sinai generations earlier, when they first sought refuge in a land that had welcomed them as useful additions to the royal workforce. That same inexplicable line endured, where Egypt writhed in affliction and the Hebrews knew refuge, as though two cosmic domains overlapped, yet never touched within the same soil. Royal observers who investigated this phenomenon reported their findings with the careful precision of administrators who understood that accurate record-keeping might be their only defense against accusations of incompetence or treason. As midnight approached and the full scope of the supernatural visitation became clear, Pharaoh found himself confronted with evidence that the cosmic order sustaining his kingdom had been challenged by powers that recognized no Egyptian precedents, acknowledged no pharaonic authority, respected no divine hierarchy that placed him at the apex of earthly and celestial governance. The creature that symbolized fertility and renewal had become an agent of disruption that threatened the stability of civilization itself. In chambers where the God King attempted to rest despite croaking voices that penetrated even the thickest palace walls, royal dreams filled with images of abundance transformed into accusation, blessing become curse. Divine favor revealed as supernatural displeasure that exceeded all previous experience of cosmic justice and celestial judgment rendered against kingdoms that had failed to acknowledge powers greater than any earthly throne. Aaron struck the earth with his staff at the moment when the morning sun first touched the eastern mountains, and the dust of Egypt became a living torment that would test every assumption about the boundaries between the possible and the miraculous. The impact sent tremors through soil that had been blessed by pharaonic authority since the first dynasty, particles rising from ground that had supported temples and monuments to immortal glory. Fine matter transformed instantaneously into something that belonged more to nightmare than natural philosophy. The priests who witnessed this transformation from their positions on temple steps throughout the kingdom felt the first microscopic invaders penetrate their carefully maintained ritual purity within heartbeats of the Hebrew prophet's gesture. These holy men, whose daily ablutions and ceremonial preparations had maintained their worthiness to approach divine presence for decades, discovered that spiritual cleanliness meant nothing when confronted by parasites that recognized no distinction between sacred and profane flesh, between bodies consecrated to divine service and ordinary mortal forms. Lice swarmed from every surface where the rod-bearer's staff had disturbed the fundamental order that kept living and non-living substances in their proper categories. From temple courtyards where pilgrims had prostrated themselves before gold-leafed statues, from palace gardens where exotic plants had been arranged according to principles of sacred geometry, from workshop floors where master craftsmen had shaped precious materials into forms worthy of immortal appreciation. Everywhere that earth existed within the boundaries of the two lands, crawling pestilence emerged with the systematic thoroughness of an army that acknowledged no natural limitations. Never in the royal records, spanning millennia of prodigies and portents, was there an entry to match the totality of this transformation. Unlike the river's contamination, which had affected only aquatic environments, or the amphibian invasion, which had emerged from specific sources, this infinitesimal swarm manifested simultaneously across the entire kingdom, with coordination that suggested intelligence operating on scales beyond human comprehension. Janus and Jambres, those twin practitioners of the mystical arts whose knowledge had previously matched every demonstration of Hebrew supernatural power, found themselves confronted by phenomena that resisted all attempts at replication or control. In their private chambers, where arcane implements lined walls carved with protective symbols, where centuries of accumulated wisdom had been preserved in texts too dangerous for ordinary minds to comprehend, the court sorcerers discovered that their most sophisticated techniques produced nothing but failure and frustration. The invisible army that had emerged from the shepherd's companion's gesture operated according to principles that transcended the established boundaries between matter and consciousness, between substance and spirit, between the natural world and the realm of divine intervention. Every grain of powder that covered the kingdom's surface, from the finest particles in palace reception halls to the coarsest granules in rural farmyards, had been conscripted into service that acknowledged no earthly authority, respected no magical defenses, yielded to no traditional methods of supernatural combat. Throughout the land, the keepers of ceremony found their obligations twisted into burdens, their faith tested in ways no theology had foreseen. The elaborate purification rituals that preceded every approach to divine altars became meaningless when tormentors emerged from the very materials used for spiritual cleansing. Sacred oils blessed according to formulas preserved since the construction of the first temples could not protect skin that had become territory disputed between human will and microscopic persistence. In the great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, where the most prestigious clergy in the kingdom had maintained unbroken liturgical traditions for centuries, ritual specialists discovered that their most solemn ceremonies had been reduced to undignified displays of scratching and discomfort that made concentration on divine mysteries impossible. The hymns that had praised celestial powers with words refined through generations of theological scholarship now emerged as fragmented attempts at devotion, interrupted by physical needs that reduced spiritual transcendence to animal responses. Palace physicians, whose knowledge of bodily health had been accumulated through careful observation and systematic study, found themselves confronted by afflictions that responded to no known remedies, yielded to no traditional treatments, acknowledged no medical authority based on centuries of accumulated expertise. Their most precious medications, compounded from ingredients imported from the ends of the earth and prepared according to formulas guarded as state secrets, proved as ineffective as common dirt when applied to conditions that transcended purely physical causation. The God King himself experienced the humiliation of discovering that divine flesh suffered equally with mortal bodies when confronted by pestilence that recognized no distinction between royal blood and common humanity. In his private chambers, where golden fixtures reflected light that spoke of eternal glory, where every surface had been crafted to remind him of his cosmic significance, the pharaoh found himself reduced to behaviors that would have been undignified in the humblest peasant dwelling. Sleep became impossible throughout the kingdom, as the dust-born affliction maintained constant presence that acknowledged no circadian rhythms, respected no natural cycles of rest and activity, yielded to no human attempts to establish periods of relief through behavioral modification or environmental control. Nobles accustomed to luxury that surpassed anything available to ordinary mortals discovered that wealth provided no protection against tormentors that treated silk and burlap with equal indifference. The royal workshops where master artisans had created treasures worthy of divine appreciation became theaters of frustrated productivity as craftsmen found their hands too unsteady for delicate work, their concentration too fragmented for complex projects, their traditional skills rendered useless by physical discomfort that made precision impossible. Gold leaf cracked when applied by fingers that could not remain motionless. Precious stones were miscut by jewelers, whose vision blurred with involuntary tears. Elaborate carvings emerged flawed from tools wielded by hands that moved without conscious direction. Sacred attendants who had dedicated their lives to maintaining the ritual purity that made divine service possible discovered that their most fundamental assumptions about cleanliness and contamination had been rendered meaningless by afflictions that emerged from sources too small to see, too numerous to count, too persistent to discourage through any traditional methods of spiritual or physical defense. The lustrations that had prepared them for communion with celestial powers now served only to provide temporary relief that vanished the moment purification ceremonies concluded. In royal kitchens, where elaborate feasts had been prepared according to recipes that balanced nutritional requirements with ceremonial significance, cooks found their traditional skills compromised by conditions that made food preparation a trial of endurance rather than artistic expression. Bread dough kneaded by hands that could not remain still emerged from ovens with textures that suggested distraction rather than professional competence, while sauces stirred by wooden spoons, wielded with involuntary jerks, developed consistencies that bore little resemblance to intended results. The court magicians, who had served as advisors in matters beyond ordinary human comprehension, found themselves forced to acknowledge limitations that struck at the foundation of their professional identity. In chambers where supernatural implements had been arranged according to principles derived from millennia of mystical study, the royal mystics discovered that their accumulated expertise meant nothing when confronted by phenomena that operated outside established magical categories. For generations, they had bound human ritual to the rhythm of the heavens, but now the temple's stargazers found their vision broken by earthly conditions that smothered concentration. The careful measurements that determined proper timing for religious festivals became exercises in approximation when undertaken by scholars whose attention wandered, despite their desperate attempts to maintain professional focus on mathematical precision that had previously defined their scholarly identity. Still, in the Hebrew quarter of Goshen, the descendants of Jacob continued their daily routines with the same calm that had characterized their response to the previous supernatural demonstrations. Their skin remained free from the affliction that tormented their neighbors. Their children played without the constant scratching that had become universal throughout the rest of the kingdom. Their livestock grazed peacefully, while Egyptian animals struggled with tormentors that seemed to target every living creature, except those dwelling within boundaries that acknowledged different cosmic authority. As the day progressed and the full scope of the dust-borne pestilence became apparent, even the most skeptical court officials found themselves confronted by evidence that transcended natural explanation. The brothers who had mastered every known technique of supernatural manipulation stood before their pharaoh with expressions that spoke louder than any formal acknowledgement of defeat. Their failure to replicate or counter the Hebrew demonstration had implications that extended far beyond personal embarrassment into realms where theological and political authority intersected in ways that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying Egyptian civilization. "This is the finger of a god," they declared, their voices carrying the weight of professional judgment that had been earned through decades of study in mystical arts that had never before encountered phenomena beyond their capacity to understand or control. The admission represented more than personal defeat. It constituted recognition that powers existed which operated outside the cosmic hierarchy that had sustained pharaonic authority since the unification of the two lands under divine kingship, that had seemed eternal until this moment of unprecedented challenge to assumptions that had never required defense, because they had never been tested by forces that acknowledged no Egyptian precedence, no earthly supremacy, no authority except their own. Biting flies engulfed Egypt at the precise moment when the sun reached its zenith, their arrival marked not by gradual emergence, but by instantaneous materialization that transformed clear morning air into a living storm of wings and hunger. These were not the ordinary insects that had always shared the kingdom's abundant ecosystem, but creatures possessed of supernatural persistence and intelligence that seemed to understand their mission, extended beyond mere survival into realms where celestial will manifested through aerial warfare, conducted on scales that dwarfed any human military campaign. Swarms descended from every direction simultaneously, from desert wastes where nothing should have been able to breed in such numbers, from mountain peaks where atmospheric conditions made insect life impossible, from regions so distant that natural migration could not have delivered them to the two lands within mortal lifespans. Yet here they gathered in clouds so dense they obscured the sun itself, their collective buzzing creating harmonies that resembled battle hymns sung by armies too vast for human comprehension. Goshen remained an untouched island of tranquility amidst this supernatural tempest, its boundaries marked not by walls or barriers visible to human eyes, but by lines of demarcation that seemed carved into reality itself by powers that acknowledged no earthly authority. Hebrew children played in courtyards where clear air carried only the sounds of ordinary daily life, while beyond the invisible frontier that separated their territory from the rest of the kingdom, winged tormentors made existence a trial of endurance that tested every assumption about celestial favor and cosmic justice. Throughout the palace complex, servants discovered that wealth and status provided no protection against aerial plague that treated gold and clay with equal contempt. Winged pestilence invaded throne rooms, where foreign ambassadors had prostrated themselves before pharaonic majesty, penetrated private chambers where the god king had received the ritual attentions that maintained his sacred nature, filled corridors that had echoed with the footsteps of courtiers, whose influence shaped the policies of kingdoms stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates. Commercial activity throughout the two lands ground to a halt as traders found their caravans besieged by insect hordes, whose persistence exceeded any natural behavior patterns recorded in the extensive archives where scribes had documented unusual phenomena for 3 millennia. Buzzing multitudes pursued merchant expeditions with systematic determination that suggested intelligence operating according to strategic principles rather than mere instinct, following specific individuals and cargo loads with accuracy that transformed ordinary business travel into exercises in survival. Palace kitchens became battlegrounds where cooks struggled to prepare meals worthy of pharaonic consumption, while aerial armies launched coordinated attacks on every attempt at food preparation. Bread emerged from ovens, bearing evidence of winged visitors who had somehow penetrated sealed baking chambers, while elaborate sauces developed textures that spoke of contamination, rather than culinary artistry, refined through generations of professional expertise, passed down from master to apprentice, according to traditions that had served pharaonic tables since the First Dynasty. Merchants who attempted to flee the kingdom by seeking refuge in Goshen discovered that the protected quarter's immunity extended only to its permanent residents, not to visitors who carried with them the marks of citizenship in a realm under celestial judgment. Biting insects followed these refugees with supernatural accuracy, maintaining their torment even within boundaries, where Hebrew families continued their daily routines undisturbed by phenomena that had transformed the rest of civilization into a theater of supernatural warfare. Food stores throughout the major cities became repositories of contamination, as winged pestilence penetrated granaries that had been constructed according to architectural principles designed to exclude every known form of vermin. Palace inspectors who examined these facilities reported damage that transcended mere consumption. Stored grain had been rendered inedible through contact with creatures whose presence seemed to corrupt rather than simply destroy, whose very touch transformed sustenance into substances that threatened health rather than supported it. Beyond the physical realm, this fourth demonstration of Hebrew power challenged theological assumptions that had sustained civilization for millennia. Temple priests found their sacred ceremonies disrupted by aerial visitors whose behavior suggested deliberate mockery of religious traditions that had maintained cosmic order since the unification of the two lands under pharaonic kingship. Buzzing multitudes filled sanctuaries during the most solemn rituals, their noise drowning out prayers that had been refined through centuries of liturgical development. Palace guards, accustomed to maintaining security through vigilance and martial skill, discovered their traditional methods rendered useless against enemies too numerous to count, too small to engage with conventional weapons. too persistent to discourage through shows of force that had previously deterred every challenge to pharaonic authority. Ceremonial armor provided no protection against attackers, whose size allowed penetration of gaps that had never been considered vulnerabilities, while weapons designed for human combat proved laughably inadequate for aerial warfare, conducted by opponents whose numbers exceeded the population of entire provinces. Even as the sovereign attempted to maintain the dignity appropriate to his cosmic status, Pharaoh found himself confronted by evidence that his authority meant nothing to forces that acknowledged no earthly hierarchy, respected no privilege, yielded to no displays of imperial power that had previously commanded submission from kingdoms throughout the known world. Palace chambers that had witnessed the prostration of conquered kings became stages for humiliation that reduced sacred pretensions to mortal vulnerability shared with the humblest peasant dwelling. Desperate attempts to negotiate some form of accommodation with the Hebrew leadership resulted in conversations that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between assumptions about celestial authority and theological principles that recognized no compromise with powers claiming dominion over territories already assigned to other cosmic rulers. Moses, that weathered shepherd whose appearance continued to mock every convention of protocol, listened to offers of partial concession with the patience of one whose instructions came from sources that acknowledged no obligation to accommodate earthly convenience. Palace advisors who had built their careers on finding diplomatic solutions to international crises discovered their expertise meant nothing when applied to conflicts between celestial authorities whose nature transcended the boundaries of ordinary political negotiation. Proposals for limited Hebrew worship within the kingdom's territory were rejected with the quiet firmness of representatives whose mandate admitted no modification, no partial implementation, no gradual transition that might preserve face for both parties while achieving practical accommodation. The fields of the realm staggered under disruption that placed food security in jeopardy, making earlier famines appear almost insignificant. Winged tormentors drove livestock to distraction, their persistent attacks making normal feeding impossible, while transforming pastoral scenes that had inspired countless artistic celebrations into landscapes of animal suffering that spoke of cosmic displeasure expressed through biological warfare conducted with systematic efficiency. Scribal schools, where young men had learned the hieroglyphic arts that preserved civilization's accumulated wisdom, found their educational activities rendered impossible by aerial armies, whose presence made concentration on intellectual pursuits a fantasy rather than practical possibility. Students who had memorized thousands of characters representing concepts fundamental to understanding of reality discovered their mental discipline meant nothing when applied to environments where physical comfort had been transformed into constant trial, requiring attention that left no room for scholarly contemplation. Hebrew slaves continued their assigned labor throughout the kingdom with the same efficiency that had made them valuable members of the workforce, their productivity unaffected by conditions that rendered other workers incapable of maintaining normal performance standards. This contrast between protected and afflicted populations created administrative complexities that challenged every assumption about how supernatural intervention might be expected to manifest in practical governance of territories under celestial judgment. Temple astronomers, whose observations had guided religious festivals for generations, found their careful measurements compromised by atmospheric conditions that made celestial observation impossible during daylight hours, when astronomical phenomena should have been visible to trained eyes, using instruments refined through centuries of scientific development. Star charts became exercises in approximation, when atmospheric interference prevented the precise calculations that aligned earthly ceremonies with cosmic events, that determined proper timing for rituals designed to maintain harmony between mortal and heavenly realms. Court physicians discovered their medical expertise rendered irrelevant by conditions that responded to no known treatments, acknowledged no pharmaceutical interventions, yielded to no surgical procedures that had been developed through careful study of human anatomy and systematic experimentation with therapeutic techniques. Palace dispensaries filled with patients whose afflictions transcended purely physical causation, whose symptoms suggested supernatural rather than natural origins for their suffering. The trade routes that once tied Egypt's wealth to markets across the Mediterranean fell apart, as the swarms from the skies made all but the most urgent travel impossible. Trade routes that had carried grain to distant kingdoms, brought exotic luxury goods to palace workshops, maintained the economic relationships that supported imperial ambitions, all became unusable pathways through territories where travel meant exposure to torment that exceeded human capacity for endurance. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the kingdom, the God King found himself confronted by advisors whose traditional counsel had been rendered obsolete, by circumstances that transcended every precedent in the extensive records where scribes had documented supernatural events throughout the nation's history. For the first time since assuming sacred authority, Pharaoh faced the possibility that his cosmic mandate might be challenged by powers whose nature exceeded his understanding, whose authority might supersede his own, whose intentions toward his kingdom remained opaque despite mounting evidence of their capacity to transform reality according to principles that acknowledged no pharaonic precedents, no earthly supremacy, no hierarchy except their own. Silent fields stretched across Egypt at dawn, their emptiness more profound than any sound that had ever echoed through the two lands. Where thousands of cattle had grazed beneath yesterday's sun, only stillness remained, a quietude so complete it seemed to press against human ears with weight that spoke not of peace but of cosmic judgment, rendered with surgical precision. The livestock that had sustained civilization since the first farmers learned to domesticate wild aurochs lay motionless in postures that suggested not disease but instantaneous cessation, as if some celestial hand had reached down to still 10,000 hearts with a single gesture. War horses in palace stables, those magnificent creatures whose bloodlines traced back to gifts exchanged between pharaohs and foreign kings, rested in their stalls with the unnatural stillness of statues carved from living flesh. These steeds, bred for courage that would carry warriors into battle without hesitation, trained for endurance that could sustain campaigns across desert wastes, pampered with feed imported from distant provinces, all had succumbed to whatever force had swept through the kingdom during the darkest hours before sunrise. Their glossy coats still gleamed with the care lavished upon them by grooms who had awakened to discover their charges transformed into monuments to mortality. Across the fertile delta, where agriculture had flourished since time immemorial, pastoral scenes that had inspired countless artistic celebrations became landscapes of desolation that challenged every assumption about the relationship between divine favor and earthly prosperity. Herds that had represented wealth beyond calculation, breeding stock that embodied generations of careful selection and genetic improvement. Working beasts whose labor had made possible the construction of monuments that scraped heaven's vault, all reduced to carcasses that would require burial on scales unprecedented in human experience. Leather workshops throughout the major cities faced catastrophe that transcended mere economic disruption and entered realms where entire industries vanished overnight. Master craftsmen, whose skills had been refined through decades of apprenticeship, discovered their raw materials transformed from valuable commodities into urgent public health hazards that required immediate disposal rather than careful processing. The hides that should have become sandals for palace courtiers, harnesses for ceremonial chariots, bindings for papyrus scrolls that would preserve royal decrees, all became sources of contamination rather than prosperity. Palace messengers who rode forth at first light to assess the scope of this supernatural catastrophe returned with reports that defied comprehension through any framework of natural causation. From Memphis to the cataracts, from the western desert to the eastern marshlands, the pattern remained identical. Simultaneous cessation of life in creatures whose health had shown no previous sign of decline, whose vital force had been extinguished with precision that suggested intelligence operating on cosmic scales, rather than disease following biological pathways. Investigators dispatched by the court to examine specific cases discovered evidence that eliminated every conventional explanation for mass mortality. The fallen beasts showed no symptoms of plague, no signs of poisoning, no indication of violence or trauma that might account for their simultaneous expiration. Their bodies remained intact, unmarked by any visible cause of their transition from life to lifelessness, as if existence had simply been withdrawn from them by powers that acknowledged no need to operate through natural mechanisms. Pride transformed into bewilderment as palace officials who had built their careers on understanding administrative complexities found themselves confronted by phenomena that resisted every attempt at rational analysis. Veterinarians whose expertise had been developed through systematic study of animal physiology discovered their accumulated knowledge rendered useless when applied to mortalities that transcended purely physical causation. The most learned physicians in the kingdom stood helpless before evidence of intervention that operated outside every category they had been trained to recognize. Throughout the Hebrew quarter, however, an entirely different reality prevailed, with the same stark clarity that had marked previous demonstrations of selective supernatural protection. Descendants of Jacob tended herds that grazed peacefully in meadows, where not a single creature had perished, their livestock displaying the robust health that spoke of blessing rather than mere survival. These protected flocks and herds continued their normal routines, grazing, breeding, producing milk and wool, while their owners observed the catastrophe that had befallen their neighbors with the solemn recognition of those who understood themselves to be witnesses to divine judgment. Sacred bulls throughout the kingdom's temples, those specially chosen creatures whose perfect forms had been consecrated to serve as earthly representatives of celestial powers, lay motionless in sanctuaries where their presence had embodied the connection between mortal and immortal realms. The Apis bull at Memphis, that living god whose every movement had been interpreted as divine communication, rested in eternal stillness that spoke more eloquently than any oracle about the shifting balance of cosmic authority. The transport networks binding Egypt's distant provinces unraveled, as the beasts of burden that once carried people and goods across the land could no longer serve the empire's needs. Caravans that had carried trade goods to markets throughout the known world found themselves stranded without the animals that made long-distance commerce possible, while military units discovered their mobility reduced to whatever distances human feet could cover without the assistance of creatures that had extended the reach of pharaonic power across territories spanning continents. For the commanders, the crisis carried consequences that reached past battlefield tactics into questions that forced a rethinking of the very principles of imperial defense. Cavalry units that had formed the backbone of frontier security discovered their mounts transformed from instruments of warfare into urgent disposal problems, while chariot corps that had terrorized enemies from Nubia to the Euphrates found their vehicles rendered useless by the absence of creatures trained to draw them into battle with disciplined coordination. What had been routine assessments of wealth became hopeless reckonings. the numbers charting a ruin that no financial order could repair. The breeding programs that had required decades to establish. The careful genetic selection that had produced animals superior to any found in neighboring kingdoms. The accumulated capital represented by herds that had been built through centuries of patient investment. All erased in a single night by forces that acknowledged no concern for human planning or material ambition. Temple offerings that had maintained proper relationships with celestial powers since the first dynasty faced suspension as the creatures traditionally sacrificed to ensure divine favor no longer existed within the kingdom's borders. Priests discovered their most fundamental religious obligations, compromised by the absence of animals whose lives had been regularly offered to secure continued cosmic harmony. While the elaborate ceremonial calendar that governed spiritual life required modification to accommodate realities that no theological tradition had anticipated. Even the palace kitchen faced disruption that transformed daily routines into exercises in adaptation, as cooks discovered their traditional sources of meat, milk, and eggs had vanished overnight. The royal diet, carefully planned to provide nutrition appropriate for divine physiology, required immediate revision to rely entirely upon plant sources and preserved foods that had been stored against emergencies that previous generations had never imagined might include the total elimination of livestock from the kingdom's territory. Pharaoh's investigators, those trusted officials whose reports had always provided accurate information about conditions throughout the realm, returned from their survey of the Hebrew territories with testimony that confirmed what palace observers had begun to suspect. Not one creature belonging to the descendants of Jacob had expired. Not one animal under their care showed any sign of the mysterious force that had swept through the rest of the kingdom, like an invisible plague that killed without touching, destroyed without damaging, eliminated life while leaving physical forms intact. Dairy production that had supplied palace and temple with products essential for both nutrition and ritual ceased to exist as a functioning industry. The elaborate network of collection, processing, and distribution that had developed over centuries to handle the output of herds spread across multiple provinces became obsolete in a single morning when the sources of milk, cheese, and butter simply vanished from the economic landscape that had supported these complex commercial operations. Master builders who had relied upon oxen to transport the massive stone blocks required for monumental construction discovered their projects indefinitely suspended by the absence of creatures capable of moving materials that human strength alone could never manage. The engineering techniques that had raised pyramids and temples, obelisks and palaces, had all depended upon animal power that complemented human skill, and without these partnerships between mortal intelligence and brute strength, architectural ambition faced limitations that seemed insurmountable. Silence descended upon the kingdom like a shroud woven from absence itself. The quiet that followed when 10,000 voices that had lowed and neighed, bleated and bellowed, suddenly ceased their contributions to the symphony of sounds that had marked rural life since agriculture began. Farmers, accustomed to beginning their days with the familiar noises of creatures stirring in barns and paddocks, awakened to stillness that spoke more powerfully than any proclamation about the nature of powers that could reach into the heart of civilization to remove essential elements with precision that left everything else untouched. Pride, that quality which had sustained pharaonic confidence through 3 millennia of uninterrupted success, began its transformation into something that would either become wisdom or harden into the kind of stubborn resistance that invited even more dramatic demonstrations of supernatural authority. Evidence accumulated with each passing hour that forces existed which operated outside every framework that had previously contained Egyptian understanding of divine intervention, cosmic justice, and the proper relationship between earthly rulers and celestial powers that determined the fate of kingdoms and the mortals who dared to govern them in heaven's name. Furnace ash thrown skyward by Moses became burning snow that fell upon every exposed surface throughout the two lands, each particle transforming into torment the moment it touched flesh that had known no greater discomfort than the gentle caress of linen robes blessed by temple incense. The powder that descended from heights where only birds had previously traveled carried with it celestial malice that seemed to understand exactly how to locate every portion of the human form, penetrating clothing that should have provided protection, finding paths through defensive barriers that had never been tested against assault from heavenly directions. What began as gentle precipitation, resembling the finest dust from grinding mills, became plague incarnate as soon as contact occurred between the falling particles and living tissue. Boils erupted with volcanic suddenness wherever the cursed powder touched bare flesh, sores that pulsed with their own rhythm, independent of heartbeat or breath, lesions that spoke of corruption introduced from sources beyond natural contamination. The pain that accompanied these eruptions transcended ordinary physical discomfort and entered realms where agony became a language that communicated messages about divine displeasure written directly onto the bodies of those who had failed to acknowledge powers greater than earthly authority. Burning eruptions on hands made every gesture an exercise in careful endurance, transforming the simple act of grasping objects into trials that required deliberation where instinct had once sufficed. Artisans whose skills had been refined through decades of precise manipulation discovered their fingers too swollen and tender for the delicate work that had defined their professional identity, while scribes found that holding reed pens became impossibility rather than natural extension of thought translated into hieroglyphic permanence. The sores that manifested on feet transformed walking from automatic function into conscious navigation of pain that made every step a negotiation between necessary movement and the agony that accompanied pressure on afflicted surfaces. Palace courtiers who had glided through marble corridors with the graceful confidence that marked their elevated status, now moved with the careful deliberation of invalids learning to adapt to limitations that reduced their former elegance to awkward shuffling that spoke of mortality rather than refined sophistication. Moses stood untouched amidst the divine precipitation, his weathered features unmarked by particles that seemed to avoid him, with the same precision they showed in seeking out every other mortal within the kingdom's borders. The Hebrew prophet's immunity served as visible testimony to the source of this affliction, his unmarked flesh providing stark contrast to the suffering that surrounded him, as palace officials discovered their authority meant nothing to cinders that recognized only the cosmic hierarchy that had dispatched them on their mission of celestial judgment. Palace physicians, those learned men whose expertise had been developed through careful study of human anatomy and systematic experimentation with therapeutic techniques, found themselves confronted by conditions that responded to no known treatments and seemed to mock every principle they had been taught about the relationship between cause and effect in medical science. Their most precious medications, compounded from ingredients imported from distant territories and prepared according to formulas guarded as state secrets, proved as useless as river mud when applied to pustules that had been created through divine rather than natural processes. Even the most sophisticated understanding of bodily function that had been accumulated through centuries of systematic observation became irrelevant when applied to afflictions that operated outside every category that traditional healing recognized. Remedies that had proven effective against ordinary conditions not only failed to provide relief, but seemed to aggravate lesions that responded to therapeutic intervention with increased virulence, as if the divine source of these wounds resented human attempts to counteract celestial judgment through mortal ingenuity. Those who had built their reputations on maintaining physical perfection that reflected their elevated status discovered their carefully cultivated appearance transformed into advertisements of vulnerability that reduced social prominence to shared participation in collective humiliation. Nobles whose beauty had been enhanced through cosmetic arts that made them worthy companions for pharaonic majesty found their faces marked with eruptions that no amount of artistic skill could disguise or minimize through traditional techniques of aesthetic enhancement. What had been temples filled with the sounds of daily worship became silent chambers, where clergy could no longer perform the rituals that maintained cosmic order since the first dynasty. Holy men, whose spiritual authority had been established through decades of careful observance of purification protocols, found themselves barred from sanctuaries where their presence might contaminate offerings intended to secure continued favor for the kingdom and its rulers. Daily offerings that fed the gods and maintained the delicate balance between mortal and immortal realms required postponement when those responsible for presenting them discovered their limbs too damaged to handle sacred implements with the reverence that such service demanded. The elaborate ceremonial calendar that coordinated earthly activities with celestial events faced disruption that threatened to upset relationships between human and divine authorities that had been carefully maintained through 3,000 years of uninterrupted ritual observance. Janus and Jambres, those twin practitioners of the mystical arts whose knowledge had previously enabled them to replicate Hebrew demonstrations of cosmic power, arrived at the palace carried on litters because their extremities could no longer support walking distances that had once been accomplished without conscious effort. The court magicians, whose expertise had made them valuable advisors in matters beyond ordinary human understanding, discovered their accumulated wisdom rendered useless by afflictions that had been imposed through powers that operated outside every magical tradition they had studied since childhood. The brothers, who had mastered techniques for manipulating otherworldly forces, found themselves unable to stand in the presence of their pharaoh, their professional dignity reduced to the helpless dependence of invalids whose condition testified more eloquently than any formal acknowledgement that they had encountered phenomena beyond their capacity to understand, control, or counteract, through methods that had served them faithfully throughout their careers as servants of the court and students of arcane knowledge. What had once been smooth flesh became landscapes of pain that mapped divine displeasure directly onto mortal bodies, creating visual evidence of cosmic judgment that could not be hidden, denied, or explained away, through reference to natural causes that might absolve earthly authorities of responsibility for circumstances that had invited celestial intervention. The marks that covered every visible surface served as permanent reminders of the confrontation between powers that acknowledged no compromise, no shared authority, no peaceful coexistence on territories where competing claims to cosmic dominion had been established through demonstrations that transcended diplomatic negotiation. Palace mirrors that had reflected images worthy of pharaonic admiration now showed only evidence of mortality, expressed through disfigurement that made previous concepts of physical beauty seem like exercises in vanity rather than appropriate maintenance of appearances that reflected inner spiritual condition. The reflection that met every gaze spoke of vulnerability rather than strength, of subjection rather than authority, of cosmic displeasure rather than favor that had supposedly sustained pharaonic rule since the unification of the two lands under sacred kingship. Litters arrived throughout the palace complex to transport officials whose feet could no longer carry them through administrative duties that had once been accomplished with efficient ease, their elevated transportation now serving necessity rather than ceremonial dignity. The conveyances that had once symbolized high status became medical equipment required for basic mobility, transforming symbols of privilege into testimony about the democratizing effect of supernatural judgment that recognized no distinction between noble and common flesh when rendering cosmic verdicts. Sacred attendants who had dedicated their lives to maintaining the ritual purity that made worship possible discovered their most fundamental assumptions about cleanliness and contamination, challenged by afflictions that emerged from within their own bodies, rather than external sources that could be avoided through careful behavior and proper protective protocols. The lustrations that had prepared them for communion with celestial powers became meaningless when the contamination that barred them from holy service originated from supernatural sources, rather than environmental contact with defiling substances. The elaborate hierarchy that had organized palace life according to principles of proximity to pharaonic authority found itself flattened by shared participation in suffering that made previous distinctions between elevated and subordinate positions seem like arbitrary social conventions, rather than reflections of cosmic order that placed individuals in their proper relationships to sacred power. The democratizing effect of universal affliction revealed how much of the kingdom's social structure had depended on the maintenance of physical differences that divine intervention had eliminated through impartial distribution of discomfort. Perfumed oils that had masked the ordinary sense of human mortality now served to highlight the corruption that seeped from lesions that spoke of decay introduced from celestial sources rather than natural decomposition that followed predictable biological pathways. The fragrances that had created olfactory environments appropriate for palatial habitation became instruments of irony that emphasized rather than concealed evidence of divine displeasure written directly onto flesh that had been marked for cosmic judgment. Servants throughout the palace discovered their traditional duties compromised by physical limitations that made routine tasks into exercises requiring careful planning and frequent rest, transforming efficient household management into slow negotiations, with pain that acknowledged no schedule, respected no urgent priorities, yielded to no amount of determination or professional dedication that had previously enabled them to maintain the complex domestic systems that sustained pharaonic magnificence in forms appropriate for residence among mortal surroundings. The cosmic trial that had begun with water transformed into blood and progressed through demonstrations of otherworldly power over natural elements had now moved into territory where celestial judgment was inscribed directly onto human flesh, creating evidence that could not be hidden, explained away, or attributed to coincidental natural phenomena that might preserve some possibility of denying the reality of confrontation between earthly and heavenly authorities, whose competing claims to cosmic dominion had reached the point where neutrality was no longer possible. And every individual body had become a battlefield where divine warfare would determine the ultimate source of authority over territories that both powers claimed as rightfully theirs. Black clouds gathered at the precise moment when Moses raised his staff toward the heavens, their formation defying every principle of meteorology that palace astronomers had studied since the reign of the First Dynasty. These were not the familiar storm systems that brought seasonal rains to water the fertile delta, but masses of vapor shot through with unnatural fire that burned but refused to melt the ice forming within their roiling depths. The sky itself seemed to convulse with supernatural pregnancy, birthing phenomena that belonged more to divine warfare than earthly weather patterns. The staff stretched towards celestial realms, as if drawing down powers that dwelt beyond the reach of mortal understanding. The Hebrew prophet's gesture serving as invitation to forces that had been waiting for precisely this moment, to demonstrate their authority over kingdoms that had forgotten the proper relationship between earthly rulers and cosmic sovereigns. Thunder rolled across the two lands with voices that spoke in languages older than civilization, while electrical fury illuminated cloud formations that writhed like living creatures preparing for battle. What fell from those pregnant heavens combined elements that should have been mutually exclusive, according to every natural law that scholars had identified through centuries of careful observation. Hail mixed with flame descended in a barrage that challenged fundamental assumptions about the behavior of matter under varying conditions of temperature and pressure. Ice stones the size of pomegranates blazed with inner light as they plummeted toward Earth, their crystalline surfaces containing fires that neither consumed their frozen matrix nor were extinguished by contact with water. Ice stones struck the kingdom with systematic thoroughness that suggested intelligence directing their trajectory according to strategic principles rather than random distribution determined by atmospheric currents. Every structure that had been built without regard for the Hebrew prophets' counsel became target for bombardment that exceeded anything mortal armies could deliver through siege engines or battering rams. Rooftops that had sheltered families for generations cracked beneath impacts that sent burning fragments cascading into chambers, where occupants cowered beneath furniture that provided inadequate protection against assault from celestial directions. Those who had heeded the weathered figure's advice discovered their prudent preparation rewarded with survival that seemed miraculous to neighbors who had dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a foreign mystic whose pronouncements deserved no serious consideration from civilized people. Servants and livestock that had been gathered into shelters before the bombardment began remained unharmed, while exposed creatures perished beneath impacts that combined crushing force with incendiary destruction, in ways that defied every precedent in the extensive records where royal scribes had documented unusual weather phenomena. Flax and barley, those crops whose cultivation had sustained prosperity since the earliest agricultural experiments, vanished beneath icy projectiles that left behind only charred stubble where fields of grain had waved in morning breezes just hours before the celestial assault began. The destruction was complete, total, absolute. Not a single stalk remained intact in areas where the crystalline bombardment had concentrated its fury, transforming agricultural landscapes into scenes that resembled battlefields, where divine armies had trampled mortal ambitions beneath feet of ice and flame. Ancient sycamores that had provided shade for countless generations of farmers and their animals split beneath impacts that drove burning ice deep into heartwood, seasoned by decades of growth under the beneficent sun that had suddenly become witness to atmospheric warfare, conducted on scales that dwarfed any human military campaign. These venerable trees, some old enough to have sheltered the ancestors of current landowners, fell with crashes that echoed across countryside, transformed into theater for cosmic conflict between powers that acknowledged no earthly mediation. Palace guards who had maintained security through vigilance and martial skill discovered their traditional defensive methods rendered useless against enemies that attacked from directions no fortress had been designed to repel. Ceremonial armor provided no protection against projectiles that combined physical impact with thermal assault, while shields designed to deflect arrows and spears proved inadequate against bombardment that approached from angles that made conventional combat formations meaningless exercises in futile positioning. Rooftops throughout the major cities became launching platforms for debris that transformed urban landscapes into hazard zones, where movement in open spaces invited injury or death from falling materials ignited by contact with celestial missiles. The clay tiles that had been fired in kilns, according to techniques perfected through generations of ceramic artistry, cracked beneath thermal stress that exceeded any conditions their manufacturers had anticipated, sending fragments cascading into streets where pedestrians fled towards shelters that might or might not provide adequate protection. Farmers who had ignored the Hebrew prophet's counsel paid for their skepticism with losses that exceeded any catastrophe in living memory, their life's work obliterated in minutes by forces that acknowledged no human investment in time, effort, or resources dedicated to agricultural production. The careful cultivation that had required seasons of patient labor vanished beneath impacts that left only scorched earth where prosperity had been growing toward harvest, that would never be gathered by hands now empty of everything, except regret for decisions that could not be reversed. Wheat and spelt, however, remained mysteriously untouched by the devastation that consumed their companion crops with such ruthless efficiency. These grains, planted later in the agricultural cycle and still protected within their early growth stages, survived the bombardment that destroyed mature plantings with discrimination that suggested intelligence rather than random distribution of atmospheric violence. The selectivity of the destruction challenged every assumption about natural disasters, operating according to impersonal laws that showed no favoritism toward particular species or varieties of cultivation. Mysteriously, the timing of this celestial assault coincided perfectly with agricultural schedules that would maximize damage to immediate food supplies, while preserving enough seed grain to prevent total famine that might have made recovery impossible within reasonable timeframes. The precision with which the bombardment distinguished between crops ready for harvest and those still developing spoke of planning that took into account not merely immediate punishment, but long-term consequences that balanced divine judgment against practical considerations of human survival. The selectivity extended beyond agricultural considerations into realms where moral choices made by individuals determined their experience of cosmic justice, rendered through meteorological means. Those who had demonstrated wisdom by accepting foreign counsel, despite its source in traditions that challenged their cultural assumptions, found themselves protected by decisions that had seemed merely prudent, but proved to be matters of life and death when subjected to testing through celestial bombardment. Granaries that had been constructed according to architectural principles, designed to protect stored grain from every known threat, discovered their defenses inadequate against assault that combined crushing impact with incendiary destruction in ways that made traditional storage methods obsolete. The reserves that should have sustained communities through periods of scarcity became fuel for fires that spread beyond their original containers to threaten surrounding structures with conflagration that required immediate evacuation of entire neighborhoods. Even the most sophisticated understanding of construction techniques that had been developed through centuries of building experience proved insufficient when applied to protection against attacks from directions that no architect had considered probable enough to justify defensive preparations. Engineering expertise that had raised monuments capable of withstanding earthquakes, floods, and human warfare became irrelevant when confronted by phenomena that operated outside every category of threat that building codes had been designed to address. Servants who had risked their positions by following foreign advice rather than accepted wisdom found their apparent insubordination rewarded with survival that vindicated choices their peers had criticized as evidence of contamination by alien influences that undermined proper loyalty to established authority. The vindication was complete, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or attribute to natural causes that might preserve some possibility of denying the reality of supernatural intervention in earthly affairs. Livestock that had been sheltered according to Hebrew recommendations remained unharmed while animals left, exposed to elements that should have posed no extraordinary danger, perished beneath impacts that combined blunt trauma with thermal injury in ways that exceeded any precedent in veterinary experience. The discrimination between protected and exposed creatures created stark visual evidence of the relationship between prudent attention to prophetic counsel and practical survival, in circumstances where cosmic powers demonstrated their authority through meteorological warfare. In the royal workshops where masterpieces had been fashioned for generations, the choicest substances lay ruined, transformed into hazards that put craftsmen at risk in conditions their masters could never have foreseen. Bombardment from the skies above. Gold leaf cracked when subjected to thermal stress that exceeded any conditions encountered in traditional metalworking, while precious stones shattered beneath impacts that treated rare minerals with the same destructive indifference shown toward common clay. The bombardment continued throughout the day with intensity that never diminished, as if the celestial arsenal contained unlimited supplies of ammunition that could be delivered without regard for earthly concerns about resource conservation or strategic economy. Each wave of crystalline missiles blazed with inner fire that seemed to burn more brightly as the day progressed, their luminescence creating atmospheric effects that transformed ordinary daylight into something that resembled the illumination that might be expected during cosmic battles between powers, whose nature transcended mortal categories of understanding. Fertile districts that had fed the kingdom for generations now lay in ruin, their fields reduced to blackened stubble that promised no harvest, only the slow hope of replanting that pushed recovery into the distant year ahead. The economic implications extended far beyond immediate crop losses into realms where entire systems of trade, taxation, and resource allocation required fundamental revision to accommodate realities that had been imposed through divine intervention rather than natural disaster or human conflict. As evening approached and the celestial bombardment finally ceased, the kingdom that had awakened to normal weather patterns found itself transformed into territory where the relationship between earthly authority and cosmic power had been redefined through demonstration that no mortal ruler could match, duplicate, or counteract through any resources available to human ambition, however supported by accumulated wealth, military strength, or technological sophistication that had previously seemed adequate for every challenge that earthly circumstances might present to pharaonic authority. Desert winds blew day and night at Moses' command, carrying with them a darkness that moved with purpose and hunger, a living shadow that approached from the Arabian wastes with the inexorable patience of cosmic judgment made manifest in wing and mandible. The eastern gale that swept across the two lands bore more than sand and heat. It carried the sound of 1 billion wings beating in coordination that suggested intelligence operating on scales beyond human comprehension, a collective consciousness that had been summoned to demonstrate divine authority through biological warfare conducted by creatures whose individual insignificance became terrifying when multiplied beyond the capacity of mortal minds to grasp. For 10 years, the Titanomachy had raged in distant realms where cosmic powers contested for universal dominion. And now that celestial conflict descended to earth in forms that mortal eyes could witness and mortal flesh could experience. What approached the kingdom from regions where no mapmaker had ventured was not merely an infestation, but an army whose ranks exceeded the combined populations of every nation that had ever paid tribute to pharaonic authority, whose discipline surpassed anything human generals had achieved through training, and whose mission transcended the ordinary motivations that drove earthly conquest. The swarm that materialized on the horizon resembled a storm cloud animated by malevolent intelligence, its dark mass undulating with movements that spoke of coordination, achieved without visible command structure, of purpose shared across millions of individual minds that had been united in service to powers that acknowledged no earthly sovereignty. As this aerial plague drew closer, the sound of its approach grew from distant whisper to deafening roar that drowned out every other noise. harmony of destruction that announced the arrival of forces that had come not merely to feed, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against cosmic authority. What emerged from that approaching darkness defied every category that natural philosophers had established for understanding insect behavior, revealing creatures whose size and voraciousness exceeded any species recorded in the extensive archives where royal scribes had documented unusual phenomena throughout the kingdom's long history. Each individual locust bore proportions that belonged more to the realm of nightmares than biological reality, their bodies swollen with supernatural vitality, their appetites expanded beyond natural limits by powers that had transformed ordinary creatures into instruments of divine judgment. From their lofty observation posts, the courtiers saw the swarm arrive and understood that distance could not blunt the horror of creatures obeying laws that defied all human assumptions about the balance of frailty and power. The sight of that approaching horde challenged fundamental beliefs about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, between natural phenomena and supernatural intervention, between earthly challenges that could be met with human resources and cosmic trials that required acknowledgement of powers beyond mortal control. Bark disappeared from trees throughout the kingdom as devouring hordes stripped every trace of organic material from surfaces that had been growing for decades under the beneficent sun that now illuminated their systematic destruction. Ancient sycamores that had survived floods and droughts, wars and famines, succumbed in hours to assault that left behind only skeletal frameworks of wood too hard for even these supernaturally enhanced mandibles to process, their naked branches reaching toward heavens that had become sources of judgment rather than blessing. Leather goods that represented months of skilled craftsmanship vanished beneath the attention of creatures that treated valuable materials with the same indifference they showed toward common weeds, their consumption patterns acknowledging no distinction between precious commodities and worthless debris, when everything organic had been designated for elimination through biological processes that had been accelerated beyond natural limits by powers that operated outside every category of earthly causation. Courtiers who had built their reputations on maintaining elaborate wardrobes that reflected their proximity to pharaonic magnificence discovered their most precious garments reduced to fragments in minutes by insects that treated silk and linen as mere sustenance rather than artistic achievement, refined through generations of textile mastery. Robes that had been woven from threads finer than spider webs and dyed with pigments extracted from creatures found only in the most distant provinces, became food for mandibles that acknowledged no aesthetic value, no cultural significance, no human investment in beauty transformed into utilitarian consumption. Even the palace gardens, where exotic plants had been arranged according to principles of sacred geometry that reflected cosmic order in earthly landscapes, became feeding grounds where horticultural artistry disappeared beneath systematic attention from creatures whose numbers made individual appetite irrelevant when multiplied across scales that exceeded any framework for mathematical calculation that human minds had developed for understanding quantities that approached the infinite. Weight pressed against structures throughout the kingdom as the aerial army settled on every available surface with collective mass that exceeded the tonnage of stone used in constructing the greatest pyramids, their accumulated presence creating engineering challenges that no architect had anticipated when designing buildings intended to support only their own materials, plus normal occupancy by human residents and their possessions, rather than biological infestations that defied every principle of load distribution. Surveys of the fields after the swarm showed ruin that went far beyond the loss of harvests, striking at the very foundations of survival, as every form of sustenance for human and beast alike was stripped away for the seasons ahead. Not a leaf remained on any tree. Not a blade of grass survived in any meadow. Not a single stalk of grain stood intact in fields that had represented the accumulated labor of entire communities, working in coordination to produce surplus that supported the complex social structures, enabling specialized crafts, administrative sophistication, and artistic achievement. Pharaoh's counselors, those experienced officials whose advice had guided royal policy through previous crises that had tested the kingdom's resilience, found themselves confronted by circumstances that exceeded every framework they had developed for understanding the relationship between political decisions and practical consequences. Their accumulated expertise in managing resources, allocating labor, and coordinating response to emergency conditions became irrelevant when applied to devastation that had eliminated the material basis for implementing any recovery strategy that depended on existing agricultural or economic infrastructure. Starvation loomed as an immediate prospect rather than theoretical concern, as administrators calculated the gap between remaining food reserves and the consumption requirements of a population that had grown accustomed to abundance sustained by agricultural productivity that no longer existed within the kingdom's borders. The arithmetic was stark, undeniable, terrifying. Without immediate intervention that transcended human capabilities, the civilization that had endured for 3 millennia would face collapse within months through simple inability to feed the multitudes whose specialized roles had been made possible by surplus production that had vanished beneath biological assault. A west wind arose at Moses' gesture with the same supernatural precision that had characterized every aspect of this demonstration of Hebrew divine power. Its direction and intensity perfectly calibrated to achieve removal of the aerial plague, without causing additional damage to structures that had already been weakened by the combined effects of previous supernatural interventions. The gale that swept the winged devastation toward the sea possessed characteristics that defied every principle of meteorology that palace astronomers had studied, arriving without the gradual build-up that natural weather patterns required, and maintaining consistent force across the entire kingdom, with uniformity that suggested intelligent direction rather than atmospheric pressure differentials. Officials who observed the locust's departure discovered that their removal was as complete and systematic as their arrival had been overwhelming and destructive, with not a single creature remaining within the two lands, despite numbers that had exceeded the capacity of any natural wind to transport across the distances necessary to deposit them in waters where they could not return, to continue their work of biological devastation. The precision of this extraction challenged every assumption about the relationship between natural forces and supernatural intervention, between phenomena that could be explained through reference to established physical laws and events that required acknowledgement of powers operating outside every framework that human understanding had developed for comprehending cosmic authority. The kingdom that emerged from this ordeal bore scars that would require years to heal, assuming that the resources necessary for recovery could be assembled from reserves that had been depleted by previous plagues and the widespread economic disruption they had caused throughout the complex network of trade relationships that sustained prosperity across territories stretching from the cataracts to the Mediterranean shores. Agricultural recovery alone would require multiple growing seasons, while the psychological impact of witnessing biological forces that operated according to principles that transcended natural law would influence popular attitudes toward royal authority and divine power for generations to come. Where once the warehouses brimmed with grain to sustain the realm through hardship, only bare containers remained, proof of a consumption that eclipsed all earlier experience. The cavernous spaces echoed with an absence more profound than silence, their shadows speaking of a confrontation between earthly pretensions and cosmic forces that recognized no pharaonic authority, acknowledged no shared dominion, accepted no compromise that might preserve mortal dignity, while satisfying divine demands for absolute recognition of supremacy over all territories claimed by powers whose authority derived from sources beyond human comprehension or earthly control. Absolute blackness fell across the two lands like a shroud woven from the void that existed before creation. Darkness so complete and tangible that it seemed to press against human flesh, with the weight of cosmic judgment made manifest in pure absence. This was not the familiar night that followed sunset according to natural rhythms, but something alien that had been summoned from regions where illumination had never existed, where Ra's bark had never sailed, where the very concept of visibility belonged to realms so distant that their memory had been erased from reality itself. The shadow that descended possessed substance beyond anything mortal experience had prepared observers to understand. Thick as wool, yet impenetrable as granite, flowing like liquid yet solid enough to touch with trembling fingers that could feel its texture against skin grown cold with terror. Palace courtiers who attempted to light torches discovered that flame itself had been banished from territories under this supernatural eclipse, their tinder sparking briefly before being smothered by murk that consumed fire as readily as it devoured sight. Throughout the royal chambers, where golden fixtures had reflected pharaonic majesty in displays of wealth that proclaimed divine favor, complete obscurity transformed familiar spaces into alien landscapes, where navigation required hands stretched forward like those of blind beggars seeking alms in market squares. The God King himself groped along walls that his feet had traced confidently for decades, reduced to the same helpless fumbling that marked his humblest subjects when confronted by phenomena that acknowledged no distinction between royal blood and common mortality. Palace servants who had maintained elaborate household routines according to schedules refined through generations of domestic service discovered their traditional duties impossible when performed in conditions that made the identification of objects dependent entirely upon touch, rather than vision that could distinguish between precious materials and worthless debris, through characteristics that became meaningless when everything appeared identical in universal gloom that transformed gold into clay, silk into sackcloth, masterwork into rubbish. Even the most sophisticated oil lamps that had been designed by master craftsmen to provide consistent illumination through techniques perfected over centuries of experimentation with wicks, fuels, and reflective surfaces proved useless when confronted by blackness that seemed to absorb radiance before it could escape its source, creating spheres of visibility so small that users could barely perceive their own hands holding devices that had become ornamental rather than functional. The royal kitchen, where elaborate meals had been prepared according to recipes that balanced nutritional requirements with ceremonial significance, became a hazardous environment where cooks burned themselves on braziers they could not see, cut fingers on knives whose edges remained sharp despite being invisible, stumbled over familiar obstacles that had been transformed into traps by the absence of visual reference that had previously enabled them to navigate their workspace with confident efficiency. Breathing itself became laborious as the dense obscurity seemed to thicken the very air, until lungs struggled to extract oxygen from atmosphere that felt more like liquid than gas, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, where respiratory function had previously operated according to automatic rhythms that needed no deliberate attention from minds occupied with other concerns. The physical act of survival demanded resources that had never been necessary during normal conditions when the body's maintenance could be trusted to unconscious processes. Temple complexes throughout the kingdom experienced crises that transcended practical inconvenience and entered realms where fundamental religious assumptions required examination, under circumstances that challenged every theological principle that had sustained worship for 3 millennia. Sacred flames that had burned continuously since the founding of major shrines, gutted and died, despite adequate fuel supplies, their extinction marking the first interruption in ritual observances that had connected earthly ceremonies to celestial powers through unbroken chains of tradition. Priests who attempted to maintain their ceremonial obligations discovered that their most basic religious functions became impossible when performed in conditions that made the proper handling of sacred implements dependent upon memory rather than sight. Their ritual precision compromised by inability to verify that offerings were being presented according to standards that demanded perfection in every gesture, every placement, every aspect of ceremonial performance that honored divine recipients. The great solar temples where Ra received daily worship through elaborate rituals designed to ensure his continued journey across heavenly realms, faced theological crises that questioned the fundamental relationship between earthly devotion and celestial power. When the deity whose protection they sought appeared to have abandoned his most faithful servants, to struggle in conditions that suggested his authority had been challenged by forces capable of extinguishing divine radiance through supernatural means. The entire bureaucratic structure of the kingdom collapsed into paralysis. Once scribes discovered themselves unable to discern the surfaces of papyrus, upon which the hieroglyphic script of empire had always been inscribed, characters that documented the flow of goods, the judgments of courts, and the correspondence of officials, without which the intricate administrative order that stretched across provinces from Nubia to the Mediterranean could not endure. Royal messengers who had maintained communication networks connecting distant provinces to central authority found their traditional duties impossible when travel required navigation through familiar landscapes transformed into alien territories, where roads disappeared beneath universal gloom that made direction finding dependent upon memory, rather than visual landmarks that had guided travelers for generations along routes that connected major population centers. Trade itself collapsed utterly, for merchants quickly understood that their craft rested upon visual certainties, recognition of wares being bartered, assessment of their worth through inspection under clear illumination, and movement along routes that presumed the driver's ability to see the dangers and destinations ahead. Assumptions now obliterated by conditions that made every journey, however brief, a hazardous exploration through terrain that had become openly hostile. The units charged with preserving security across Egypt found their power to act erased, as the doctrines inherited from generations of military practice collapsed under conditions in which opponents could not be tracked, comrades could not be coordinated, and weapons could not be brought to bear with any accuracy, transforming the art of battle into nothing more than mutual flailing between adversaries equally lost within their unseen environment. Hebrew territory remained an illuminated island amidst this supernatural night, its boundaries marked by transitions so sharp they resembled walls built from radiance itself, barriers that separated populations living under different cosmic authorities, whose conflicting claims to territorial dominion had been made visible through demonstrations of power that transcended every category of natural phenomena, recorded in the extensive archives where royal scholars had documented unusual events throughout the kingdom's long history. Families in Goshen continued their normal routines under skies that retained their familiar blue clarity, their children playing in courtyards where sunshine fell with the same beneficent warmth that had blessed agricultural productivity since their ancestors first sought refuge in lands that had welcomed them as useful additions to the royal workforce, their daily activities proceeding without interruption, despite supernatural interventions that had transformed neighboring territories into regions where existence itself had become a trial of endurance. The contrast between protected and afflicted populations created evidence so stark that even the most determined skeptics found their attempts to maintain denial challenged by realities that could be verified through personal experience, rather than theoretical speculation about the relationship between natural causes and supernatural effects that might be explained through reference to coincidental atmospheric conditions or psychological responses to stressful circumstances. The officials charged with examining the mystery discovered that the separation of brightness from shadow bore no relation to terrain or topography, disregarding valleys and ridges, waterways and roads, fields and habitations alike, as though the phenomenon were governed not by meteorology or astronomy, but by distinctions of blood and faith that isolated Hebrew communities from their Egyptian neighbors. Reports from brave scouts who ventured close to these boundaries described transitions that occurred within distances measurable in arm lengths, rather than the gradual changes that natural phenomena typically exhibited across geographic regions. Their testimony describing walls of radiance that rose from earth to heaven, with surfaces so clearly defined, they appeared to have been constructed by divine architects working according to blueprints that specified exact dimensions for territories under different forms of cosmic protection. As the third day of supernatural night drew toward its conclusion, whispered conversations throughout the darkened kingdom began to acknowledge possibilities that had been dismissed as foreign superstition when first proposed by Hebrew spokesmen, whose demands had seemed reasonable enough to warrant diplomatic consideration, rather than the absolute submission that circumstances were beginning to suggest might be the only alternative to escalating demonstrations of power that had already exceeded every framework for understanding divine intervention in earthly affairs. Pharaoh himself, groping through chambers where royal authority meant nothing when confronted by forces that recognized no earthly hierarchy, felt the first stirrings of something that had never before troubled his divine consciousness. Doubt about whether the cosmic mandate that sustained his rule could withstand challenges from powers whose nature exceeded his understanding and whose intentions toward his kingdom remained opaque, despite mounting evidence of their capacity to reshape reality, according to principles that acknowledged no pharaonic precedence over territories they claimed as their own, through demonstrations that threatened to culminate in consequences too terrible for mortal minds to contemplate. Warning came with the dawn, delivered by Moses in words that carried the weight of cosmic inevitability, his weathered voice pronouncing judgment that would separate this night from every other in human memory. The Hebrew prophet stood before the palace gates, speaking not threats but certainties, his pronouncement carrying the authority of one whose previous predictions had manifested with supernatural precision that had transformed skepticism into terror throughout a kingdom that had learned to fear the fulfillment of foreign prophecy more than any earthly enemy. Preparation began immediately among those who had learned to heed counsel that originated beyond Egyptian borders, families whose survival through previous plagues had depended upon accepting guidance from sources their culture had taught them to despise. In Hebrew quarters throughout Goshen, mothers examined young lambs with the careful attention of women whose children's lives depended upon selecting creatures that met specifications delivered through prophetic instruction, rather than traditional religious requirements. The chosen animals bore no blemish, their wool white as fresh linen, their eyes bright with health that would be surrendered at sunset to protect human offspring, whose safety had been promised to those who demonstrated faith through obedience to ritual commands that seemed arbitrary, until understood as components of divine theater, where cosmic powers enacted justice through ceremonies that transformed domestic routine into participation in supernatural drama. Slaughter commenced at twilight throughout the Hebrew settlements, each family performing acts that had been prescribed not by cultural tradition, but by revelation that specified every detail from the method of killing to the disposition of blood that would serve purposes extending far beyond ordinary sacrifice. The crimson fluid that flowed from severed throats carried significance that transcended its biological properties, becoming supernatural currency that would purchase protection from forces whose judgment acknowledged no earthly authority. Scarlet liquid appeared on doorposts and lintels, according to patterns that marked Hebrew dwellings, for recognition by powers that operated beyond human perception, creating visual signals that would guide supernatural agents whose mission required discrimination between protected and vulnerable populations dwelling within the same geographical territories. The marks that identified safe houses resembled hieroglyphs written in a language older than civilization, symbols that communicated meanings too profound for translation into merely human concepts. Roasted flesh filled Hebrew homes with aromas that spoke of abundance preserved through divine favor rather than economic prosperity. Families gathering around meals that combined sustenance with ceremony in ways that transformed eating into communion, with forces that had demonstrated their capacity to reshape reality according to principles that acknowledged no pharaonic precedents. The lambs that had grazed peacefully in morning pastures became evening offerings that secured promises more valuable than gold, more enduring monuments. Bitter herbs accompanied the meat with flavors that reminded participants of sufferings their ancestors had endured before divine intervention transformed bondage into preparation for liberation, their taste connecting present celebration to historical experiences that had tested faith through trials that seemed designed to destroy hope, but ultimately strengthened trust in powers whose timing operated according to cosmic rather than human schedules that demanded immediate gratification. Unleavened bread required hasty preparation that eliminated the patient waiting that normal baking demanded, its flat texture reflecting the urgency that would characterize the departure already being planned by those whose bags remained packed, whose sandals stayed bound, whose staffs rested within easy reach of hands that might need to grasp them when summons came for movement that would not permit delay for conventional travel preparations. Conversation during these meals carried undertones of finality that acknowledged this night's unique significance in the long relationship between Hebrew populations and the kingdom that had sheltered them for generations, their voices subdued by awareness that forces beyond human control were moving toward resolution of conflicts that had escalated beyond diplomatic solutions, into realms where supernatural intervention would determine outcomes that mortal negotiation had failed to achieve. Those who guarded the palace, according to traditions of discipline and alertness, discovered that their watch had become futile, as no regimen of earthly vigilance could matter once powers beyond the world prepared to reveal their supremacy through acts that eluded all categories of threat their training had ever taught them to identify or counter in the service of the throne. The deepest hour approached with silence that pressed against human consciousness, like anticipation made tangible, the kingdom holding its breath while forces gathered that would transform this midnight from chronological marker into historical watershed that divided time itself into before and after, into the age when pharaonic authority had seemed eternal, and the era when Egyptian power would be measured against demonstrations of divine supremacy. Supernatural presence moved through the two lands with inexorable precision that had characterized every aspect of the Hebrew divine demonstrations, its passage unmarked by sound, yet felt by every living creature, whose instincts recognized the approach of something that operated outside natural categories, whose authority transcended biological laws that governed ordinary relationships between predator and prey, between threat and safety, between life and forces that brought existence to its appointed conclusion. Silence descended upon the kingdom like a held breath, the moment between heartbeats stretched into eternity, while cosmic justice prepared to render judgment that had been delayed through divine patience that offered opportunities for repentance. but would not be extended indefinitely when earthly powers persisted in challenging heavenly authority through stubborn resistance that mistook temporary delay for permanent reprieve. Then the rattle began. Not gradual onset, but instantaneous manifestation throughout every dwelling, where protective marks had not been applied according to specifications that distinguished between populations under different forms of cosmic authority. The sound of breath ceasing in throats that had drawn air moments before, of hearts stopping mid-beat in chests that had sustained life, until supernatural intervention imposed mortality according to criteria that acknowledged no earthly status. Cries erupted across the darkness as parents discovered children who had been breathing moments before now lay still in beds, where sleep had been transformed into something final, their small bodies bearing no mark of violence, yet emptied of the spark that had animated them since birth, their absence creating wounds in parental hearts that no earthly healing could address, because the loss transcended physical separation. Eldest sons throughout the kingdom ceased their breathing in perfect synchronization that defied every principle of natural causation that palace physicians had studied, their simultaneous passing creating a pattern of loss that stretched from royal chambers to peasant hovels with democratic precision, that recognized no distinction between noble heritage and common blood, when divine judgment operated according to criteria that measured spiritual rather than social categories. The pharaoh's own son, heir to divine kingship, that had seemed guaranteed by birth and breeding, that connected him to cosmic forces through bloodlines that traced back to the first dynasty, lay motionless in chambers, where every luxury that earthly power could provide had surrounded him with protection that proved meaningless when confronted by authorities that acknowledged no earthly hierarchy as relevant to their cosmic purposes. From the palace came a cry that no ear had ever associated with Pharaoh, for the God King's voice, long a symbol of unshakable authority, broke into anguished sound as he clutched the body that had, moments earlier, carried the warmth of life and the glow of promise. His composure shattered in grief that made him one with every parent whose child had slipped from vibrant being into lifeless void. Throughout the two lands, lamentations rose from every household where protective marks had not been applied, their mourning connecting palace and hovel through shared experience of loss that had been imposed by powers whose authority exceeded every framework that Egyptian theology had developed for understanding the relationship between divine will and human suffering, between cosmic justice and earthly consequences. In Goshen, Hebrew families slept peacefully, behind doors marked with protective signs that had fulfilled their promised function, their children breathing steadily in beds where safety had been purchased through obedience to instructions that seemed strange, until their purpose became clear through contrast with the devastation that had befallen those who had rejected prophetic counsel or failed to apply it with the precision that divine commands required. The kingdom that had awakened confident in its eternal destiny found itself broken by grief that acknowledged no social boundaries, united in mourning that had been imposed by forces whose nature transcended every category of earthly power, whose demonstrations of authority had transformed theoretical religious discussions into practical matters of survival, that demanded acknowledgement of supernatural sovereignty over territories and populations, that belonged ultimately to whoever possessed the strength to protect them from cosmic forces that operated according to principles beyond merely human understanding. Dawn broke over a kingdom transformed by grief into something unrecognizable, its former confidence shattered by a night that had reduced pharaonic authority to the desperate pleading of a broken father clutching his son's lifeless form. 600,000 Hebrew men streamed from their settlements, like a human river suddenly released from channels that had contained it for generations, their movement creating currents of liberation that swept away every assumption about the permanence of arrangements that had seemed fixed since their ancestors first sought refuge in lands that had welcomed them as useful additions to the royal workforce. Women and children joined this unprecedented migration in numbers that defied accurate counting, their faces bearing expressions that mixed hope with terror as they abandoned homes where their families had lived for centuries, carrying possessions hastily gathered in the darkness, while palace messengers rode through Hebrew quarters, with royal commands that transformed yesterday's slaves into today's departing guests, whose continued presence had become more dangerous to Egyptian survival than their absence would be to economic productivity. Unleavened dough wrapped in clothing bore witness to the urgency that had transformed careful preparation into desperate improvisation. Families carrying sustenance that had been interrupted in its normal rising by summons that admitted no delay for conventional baking processes. The flat cakes that would emerge from these hasty preparations, when kneaded on hot stones during rest stops along their journey, would become memory made edible, each bite connecting future generations to this moment, when freedom arrived not gradually, but instantaneously, demanding immediate response from people whose lives had been shaped by patient endurance rather than sudden action. Livestock moved with the human tide in vast herds that represented wealth accumulated through generations of careful breeding and selection. Cattle and sheep whose value exceeded the gold that adorned palace chambers, their bleating and lowing adding animal voices to the symphony of liberation that echoed across delta landscapes where Hebrew settlements had thrived under arrangements that had seemed permanent until supernatural intervention revealed their temporary nature and conditional character. Those who had lived through the night, when the heavens themselves declared judgment, looked on with a mixture of awe, terror, and reluctant gratitude, understanding at last that the Hebrews carried with them the protection of powers greater than Pharaoh, and that obedience to Moses had spelled the difference between life and destruction. A revelation that shattered every certainty about the supremacy of earthly kingship in the face of cosmic dominion. Officials charged with overseeing the laboring classes, who had prided themselves on the careful order of work schedules and tallies of production, found their efforts voided in a single dawn. The entire population under their supervision vanished, their records reduced to artifacts of historical interest, reminders that arrangements once thought immovable could dissolve when confronted by powers unbound by human sovereignty. Precious metals accompanied the departing multitudes in quantities that represented more than individual wealth, but constituted transfer of national treasure from those who had accumulated it through imperial conquest to those who had earned it through suffering that qualified them for compensation beyond mere wages. Gold ornaments that had adorned palace courtiers now hung from Hebrew necks, while silver vessels that had graced royal tables found new purposes in hands that had learned their value through labor that had contributed to their creation. What began as organized departure gradually revealed itself as controlled chaos, the logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of people with their possessions and animals creating challenges that no human administrative system had been designed to handle. Yet somehow the migration maintained forward momentum through coordination that seemed to operate according to principles that transcended ordinary planning and suggested guidance from sources that understood the complexities of mass movement better than any mortal strategist. Carts creaked under loads that combined practical necessity with sentimental attachment, families choosing between items that represented generations of accumulation, and the physical limitations that determined how much weight could be transported across distances that remained unknown, but were clearly substantial enough to require careful consideration of what could be carried and what must be abandoned in dwellings that would stand empty as monuments to arrangements that had seemed permanent until cosmic intervention revealed their conditional nature. Egyptian ornaments now gleamed upon the women, who only the day before had lived as servants, their status remade in an instant into that of refugees and, beyond that, a liberated people whose departure carried wealth both as repayment for years of labor and as provision for futures yet unshaped. Journeys stretching toward destinations and durations, hidden from human sight but held within the knowledge of the divine powers whose interventions had carved open a path to freedom. A mixed multitude joined the Hebrew departure, diverse peoples whose ethnic origins connected them to various conquered territories, but whose present circumstances had aligned their interests with those of the departing slaves. Their decision to accompany the migration representing calculated assessment that safety lay in association with populations under divine protection, rather than remaining in kingdoms where supernatural judgment might continue to manifest in ways that threatened all inhabitants, regardless of their genealogical connections. Nubian servants who had been captured in military campaigns that extended pharaonic authority southward, beyond the cataracts, found themselves walking alongside Hebrew families, whose ancestors had arrived as refugees rather than captives. Their shared experience of subjugation, creating bonds that transcended ethnic distinctions and cultural differences that had previously maintained separation between populations that slavery had reduced to common conditions, requiring similar responses to opportunities for liberation. Libyan merchants who had operated within Egyptian commercial systems discovered their business relationships rendered meaningless by events that had disrupted trade networks throughout the known world. Their decision to join the Hebrew departure, reflecting practical recognition that economic recovery would require establishment of new commercial connections. In territories where supernatural protection offered better security than traditional diplomatic arrangements that had proven inadequate when tested against cosmic forces. Asiatic craftsmen, whose skills had been valued by palace workshops, found themselves carrying tools toward uncertain destinations, where their abilities might serve different masters under arrangements that remained undefined, but could hardly be worse than recent conditions that had subjected them to divine judgments whose targeting had been precise enough to distinguish between protected and vulnerable populations, yet comprehensive enough to affect everyone dwelling within the kingdom's borders. The procession that stretched across the landscape resembled nothing so much as a moving city whose population exceeded that of Memphis, its organization emerging through necessity rather than planning as families, with similar needs and destinations naturally clustered together, while specialized craftsmen formed associations that would preserve their professional knowledge during transitions, that threatened to disrupt every aspect of civilized life that depended upon stable social structures and predictable economic relationships. Dust clouds rose from this migration in columns that could be seen from great distances, their visibility serving as both practical navigation aid for scattered groups seeking to rejoin the main body of travelers and symbolic announcement to observers throughout the region that unprecedented events were unfolding that would reshape political relationships across territories whose boundaries had been established through military conquest, but might require redefinition when supernatural powers demonstrated their capacity to relocate entire populations according to principles that operated independently of human strategic planning. At the head of this vast movement, Moses walked with the staff that had become symbol of divine authority operating through mortal agency, his weathered figure leading multitudes whose numbers exceeded those of armies that had conquered kingdoms. Yet their purpose was not conquest, but departure from territories where their presence had become associated with cosmic judgments whose continuation threatened the survival of civilizations that had endured for millennia. The pillar of cloud that guided their movement rose from no earthly source, its formation defying every principle of meteorology that palace astronomers had studied, its presence providing visible evidence that this migration operated under supernatural direction that would determine not only immediate routes but ultimate destinations that remained hidden from human understanding, while being perfectly clear to divine intelligence that planned according to timescales that measured success in generations rather than seasons. Behind them, the kingdom they abandoned struggled to comprehend the scope of changes that had transformed its essential character in a single night. Economic systems that had depended on Hebrew labor facing collapse, while administrative structures that had governed their work assignments discovered their functions eliminated by departure, that had removed not only workers, but entire categories of social relationships, that had defined interactions between different populations dwelling within the same geographical boundaries. What remained was a civilization forced to confront the reality that its prosperity had depended upon arrangements that could be terminated by powers whose authority transcended earthly sovereignty, whose interventions had demonstrated that no human institution possessed ultimate control over the populations and territories that provided the foundation for imperial grandeur and cultural achievement, that had seemed eternal until tested against cosmic forces that acknowledged no earthly precedents in matters involving divine justice and supernatural protection of populations, whose loyalty belonged ultimately to powers beyond mortal comprehension. As the sun climbed above the horizon, its rays revealed a scene unmatched in all the annals of the kingdom, a mass exodus surpassing anything chronicled by generations of royal scribes, who in later years would struggle to frame the language adequate to describe the moment when divine intervention led the Hebrew people out in peace, emptying provinces in the course of a day with an effectiveness no military campaign of conquest or displacement could ever have equaled. Grief transformed into rage, with the terrible swiftness that marked all pharaonic emotions. The god-king's mourning for his dead son crystallizing into fury that demanded immediate action against those whose departure had left his kingdom stripped of its economic foundation, and his heart empty of everything except the need for vengeance that would restore some measure of cosmic balance to a world that had been overturned by foreign powers, whose authority he still refused to acknowledge as legitimate. What had begun as reluctant permission for temporary worship had become permanent exodus that left Egyptian civilization bleeding from wounds that would require generations to heal, if healing remained possible for a nation whose divine mandate had been challenged so thoroughly. The broken monarch summoned his military commanders with voices that carried none of their former confidence, his words emerging through lips that had kissed lifeless flesh just hours before, his royal authority now tempered by personal loss that had reduced pharaonic majesty to the human dimensions of parental grief seeking outlet through channels that promised some possibility of meaning, extracted from suffering that otherwise threatened to consume rational thought entirely. The palace that had witnessed countless councils of war, preparing campaigns against foreign enemies, now hosted planning sessions designed to retrieve property that had walked away under divine protection. 600 choice chariots rolled from Memphis armories, where they had rested between military campaigns that had extended the kingdom's borders from Nubia to the Euphrates, their bronze fittings gleaming with metalwork that represented the finest achievements of craftsmen, whose skills had been refined through generations of serving royal warfare. These were not ordinary military vehicles, but instruments of destruction that had terrorized enemies across the known world, their wheels designed to crush resistance, their platforms engineered to provide stable fighting positions for warriors whose training had prepared them for conquest rather than pursuit of refugees, whose only weapons were supernatural demonstrations that had already proven their effectiveness against earthly power. War horses snorted and stamped in traces that connected them to machines they had learned to fear during training that prepared them for battlefield conditions. where survival depended upon disciplined response to commands that overrode natural instincts for flight, when confronted by circumstances that threatened their lives. These magnificent creatures, bred for courage and endurance that could sustain military campaigns across hostile territories, now served purposes that had been transformed by royal grief into personal vendetta, that extended beyond strategic objectives into realms where emotional satisfaction mattered more than practical considerations of military feasibility. The pursuit began at dawn, with thunder that announced the approach of forces whose reputation had been established through decades of successful campaigns against enemies, who had learned to fear the sound of wheels approaching across terrain that provided no adequate defense against mobile warfare, conducted by professionals whose expertise had been purchased through Egyptian gold and maintained through constant training that kept skills sharp for deployment whenever pharaonic ambition required territorial expansion or defensive response to challenges against established authority. Behind the elite units rode additional forces hastily assembled from garrisons throughout the kingdom, their numbers swelling the pursuit into a military expedition that exceeded anything previously deployed against mere slave populations whose resistance had been expected to collapse at the first demonstration of organized violence applied with systematic efficiency that had proven effective against every previous challenge to royal authority, that had emerged from internal dissent or external aggression, requiring armed response to maintain cosmic order. Dust clouds marked the progress of this avenging force across landscapes that had been emptied by Hebrew departure, their passage creating visual testimony to Egyptian determination that refused to accept permanent loss of populations whose labor had sustained prosperity for generations, and whose sudden absence threatened economic collapse that would require decades of careful rebuilding to restore productivity levels that had made the kingdom the envy of neighboring civilizations, seeking similar prosperity through less effective methods of organizing human resources. The descendants of Jacob, meanwhile, had discovered their liberation complicated by geographical realities that transformed freedom into a different kind of trap, their route toward promised territories blocked by natural barriers that seemed to have been positioned by cosmic design to test faith through circumstances that challenged every assumption about divine protection, extending beyond supernatural demonstrations into practical assistance with logistical problems that exceeded human capacity to solve through conventional means, available to populations lacking military organization. Rocky walls rose on both sides of their position, like prison cells constructed by geological forces that had operated according to divine architecture rather than natural formation, their stone faces reflecting morning sunlight in patterns that created natural amphitheater, where hundreds of thousands of people found themselves gathered not by choice, but by necessity, that had driven them toward the only road that seemed passable, until it terminated at waters that stretched beyond the horizon, toward destinations that remained invisible to human eyes, seeking some indication of alternative paths. The Red Sea stretched before them, with the inexorable presence of cosmic judgment rendered in liquid form, its waters reflecting sky in depths that suggested infinity rather than merely physical obstacle that might be circumvented through alternative routes, requiring longer travel times, but eventual arrival at intended destinations. This was not temporary inconvenience, but absolute barrier that acknowledged no human engineering, recognized no mortal authority, yielded to no amount of determination or desperate improvisation that might overcome natural limitations through conventional methods. Children who had laughed during the early stages of their journey from bondage toward freedom now clung to parents whose faces bore expressions that mixed hope with growing terror as the reality of their situation became clear, through reports from scouts who had explored possible escape routes, only to discover that every alternative path led either to impenetrable stone barriers or back toward territories where Egyptian forces would have overwhelming advantages in any military confrontation between organized warriors and civilian refugees carrying household possessions. Behind them, the sound of approaching chariots grew steadily louder as the distance between pursued and pursuers diminished. According to mathematical calculations that required no complex computation to understand, bronze wheels moved faster than human feet, burdened with children and elderly people, whose pace determined the speed of movement for entire extended families, whose survival depended upon maintaining group cohesion rather than abandoning slower members to achieve escape velocities that might preserve some portion of the migration. Panic rippled through the multitudes like wind through grain fields, as the strategic impossibility of their situation became undeniable to even the most optimistic observers whose faith in divine protection had sustained them through previous trials that had tested their trust in powers whose interventions had previously arrived precisely when needed to demonstrate cosmic authority over earthly circumstances. The pillar of cloud that had guided their movement continued to rise from no visible source, yet its presence seemed insufficient protection against military forces whose bronze spear points would not be deterred by meteorological phenomena. Israel's children found themselves caught between annihilation from behind and drowning ahead, their position resembling nothing so much as cosmic theater, where divine powers had arranged circumstances to demonstrate truths about the relationship between human limitation and supernatural authority that could not be communicated through less dramatic means. Every direction offered only death, the waters that would claim their lives through drowning, the peaks that would crush them through falling stones, the warriors who would slaughter them through superior weapons and training. Abraham's offspring, who had carried with them gold and silver extracted from palace treasuries through requests that had been granted by grief-stricken nobles seeking any means to encourage departure that might end supernatural judgments, now discovered their wealth meaningless when confronted by circumstances that reduced all human achievement to equal insignificance before forces that operated according to principles that acknowledged no distinction between rich and poor, prepared and unprepared, faithful and fearful, when survival depended entirely upon intervention from sources beyond mortal control. Military professionals, approaching from behind, brought with them expertise that had been tested against the finest warriors in the known world, their skills refined through campaigns that had extended pharaonic authority across territories where resistance had been crushed through systematic application of violence that acknowledged no moral constraints when imperial objectives required elimination of opposition to Egyptian supremacy. These were not ceremonial guards whose primary function was palace display, but combat veterans whose experience had prepared them for warfare under any conditions. The aquatic barrier that blocked forward progress possessed characteristics that defied every principle of engineering that Hebrew leaders might have studied during their generations of service in palace workshops, where construction projects had required understanding of how to move massive weights across difficult terrain. No bridge could span distances that extended beyond visual range. No boats existed in sufficient numbers to transport hundreds of thousands of people with their possessions and animals across waters, whose depth remained unknown, but was clearly substantial enough to eliminate wading as viable option. Stone barriers on either flank rose to heights that made climbing impossible for populations that included infants and elderly individuals whose physical capabilities could not meet the demands that such escape routes would require. Their surfaces offering no handholds for fingers seeking purchase on rock faces that had been worn smooth by wind and weather, that had operated over geological timescales that reduced human lifespan to momentary flickering against eternal background of cosmic processes. The chosen people discovered their divine selection tested through circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate every possibility of survival through human initiative. Their faith challenged by realities that admitted no solution except supernatural intervention that would have to exceed every previous demonstration of cosmic authority over natural laws that govern the behavior of matter under normal conditions. The God who had transformed water into blood would need to transform barriers into pathways if his people were to escape destruction that approached with the mechanical inevitability of bronze wheels turning according to mathematical precision. Voices rose in complaint that mixed terror with accusation, their words carrying undertones of regret for decisions that had seemed wise when made under different circumstances, but now appeared to have led only toward death, that would claim not just individuals, but entire extended families, whose genealogies stretched back through generations that had preserved memories of promises that seemed unlikely to find fulfillment in these final moments, before military forces arrived to complete the destruction that geography had already made inevitable. As the thunder of approaching war machines grew loud enough to be heard above the sound of wind and waves, Moses raised his staff toward heavens that had witnessed every previous demonstration of divine authority over earthly limitations, his gesture carrying with it the desperate faith of leader whose people faced annihilation unless supernatural powers chose to intervene in ways that would exceed every precedent in human experience of cosmic involvement in historical events that determined the survival or destruction of populations whose existence depended entirely upon forces beyond their capacity to influence through conventional means, available to mortal agency, operating within natural limitations that seemed absolute, until tested against divine authority, that acknowledged no earthly precedents in matters involving the protection of chosen peoples, whose destiny remained hidden in purposes that transcended human understanding of cosmic justice and supernatural mercy. The staff descended through morning air that trembled with supernatural anticipation, Moses commanding forces that had slept beneath the Red Sea since creation's dawn, his weathered hand directing powers whose authority transcended every natural law that human observation had identified through centuries of studying the behavior of matter under various conditions of temperature and pressure. What followed defied every principle of physics that palace astronomers had codified, every assumption about the relationship between solid and liquid that craftsmen had relied upon in their work, every expectation about cosmic order that had sustained civilized understanding of reality's fundamental structure. An east wind arose with violence that exceeded any natural tempest, its force concentrated not across broad territories, but focused with surgical precision upon the aquatic barrier that had seemed absolute just moments before celestial intervention, began reshaping geographical features according to purposes that operated outside every framework, for understanding how celestial powers might choose to manifest their authority over earthly obstacles. The gale that struck the sea's surface possessed characteristics that belonged more to cosmic engineering than atmospheric disturbance, its direction and intensity perfectly calibrated to achieve results that exceeded human comprehension. Liquid walls began their separation, with the grinding sound of geological forces operating at accelerated speeds, the Red Sea dividing along lines that followed no natural fault or underwater ridge, but carved pathways through marine depths according to divine architecture, that created corridors where none had existed since the waters first gathered in their appointed places during the world's formation. The sight that emerged challenged every assumption about the permanent nature of geographical features that maps had recorded as unchangeable boundaries between navigable and impassable territories. The staff-bearer led his people into the revealed valley with confidence that seemed either insane or divinely inspired, his feet finding purchase on ocean floor that had been exposed to sunlight for the first time in human history, seabed transformed from aquatic environment into highway, whose construction had required suspension of natural laws that governed the behavior of liquid substances under gravitational influence. Behind him, hundreds of thousands followed with the hesitant steps of those walking through territory that existed only through supernatural intervention. Towering masses of seawater held their positions on either side of the passage with stability that mocked every principle of hydraulic engineering, their vertical surfaces creating canyon walls composed of liquid that somehow maintained structural integrity without the solid foundations that earthbound architecture required. These aquatic ramparts rose higher than the tallest buildings in Memphis, their translucent depths revealing marine life swimming in waters that had been transformed from horizontal habitat into vertical exhibitions of creatures whose natural environment now served as windows into realms that human eyes had never witnessed. Children walked through valleys that had never known footsteps, their laughter echoing off barriers composed of elements that should have crashed down upon them according to every natural law, yet held their positions with the patient strength of mountains carved from substances more durable than granite. The youngest members of the migration collected shells and strange stones from surfaces that had been hidden beneath fathoms of water since the world began, their innocent play transforming cosmic miracle into childhood adventure that would be remembered in songs for generations yet unborn. Families stumbled forward across terrain that shifted between firm passages and softer areas where marine sediment created footing that required careful navigation, their progress marked by footprints that recorded the first human presence on surfaces that had known only fish and creatures of the deep during all previous history. Elderly members of the community who had despaired of surviving the journey from bondage discovered supernatural strength, enabling them to traverse distances that would have exhausted them under normal circumstances, their endurance sustained by forces that operated beyond biological limitations. The passage stretched farther than eyes could measure, its terminus invisible beyond horizons that marked the limits of human vision, while celestial engineering continued its work of maintaining pathways through liquid architecture that defied every assumption about the relationship between matter and void, between substance and space, between natural order and supernatural intervention that could reshape reality according to principles that acknowledged no earthly precedence or limitation. Behind the liberated multitudes, pursuers approached with bronze wheels that had carried royal authority across territories where resistance had been crushed through systematic application of violence, their charioteers driving war machines into the revealed valley with confidence born from centuries of military success against enemies who had possessed only conventional weapons, rather than divine protection that might alter the fundamental rules governing warfare between mortal forces operating within natural limitations and supernatural powers whose authority transcended every category of earthly conflict. Royal warriors discovered their horses increasingly reluctant, as hooves that had thundered across ordinary battlefields now struck surfaces that had never supported terrestrial creatures, the animals' instincts recognizing dangers that their riders' intellectual training had not prepared them to evaluate correctly. These magnificent beasts, bred for courage and trained for combat conditions that had tested their discipline against every conventional form of battlefield stress, began to balk at commands that required them to enter territory where natural law had been suspended for purposes they could not comprehend. The ocean floor that had provided secure footing for pedestrian refugees proved treacherous for wheeled vehicles whose weight concentrated force in ways that the wet earth could not adequately support, chariots beginning to sink into marine sediment that had been disturbed by the supernatural engineering that created this temporary highway. Bronze fittings that had gleamed with pride during departure from Memphis now bore coatings of mud, that spoke of conditions their manufacturers had never anticipated during design phases that assumed conventional battlefield deployment, rather than pursuit through submarine landscapes. Axles designed for terrestrial warfare began to bog down in soggy ground that clung to wheels with tenacity that slowed forward progress despite drivers' increasing desperation to maintain pursuit speeds that had seemed achievable when the chase began across familiar territories, where Egyptian forces held every advantage in equipment, training, and local knowledge of terrain features that could be exploited for tactical purposes. As dawn light strengthened across this unprecedented scene, the last stragglers among the Hebrew migration climbed from the seabed onto eastern shores, where solid ground promised security from dangers that had threatened their survival throughout a night of walking through valleys that existed only through godly intervention. Behind them, the pathway that had enabled their escape remained open long enough for pursuing forces to commit themselves fully to routes that would become death traps, once celestial engineering withdrew support that had maintained liquid architecture beyond its natural limitations. The weathered figure who had led this exodus raised his staff once more, with gestures that commanded not terrestrial armies, but cosmic forces whose authority exceeded any earthly power, his movements initiating processes that would restore natural order to territories where supernatural intervention had temporarily suspended laws governing the behavior of matter under normal conditions. The divine breath that had carved corridors through marine barriers began to withdraw its support from structures that had never been intended for permanent existence. Liquid columns that had held their positions with mountain-like stability began their collapse with the inevitable force of gravity reasserting authority over substances that had been temporarily exempted from ordinary physical laws. The towering masses of seawater falling inward according to principles that palace engineers understood but had never witnessed, applied to architectural projects of such unprecedented scale and supernatural origin. The kingdom's forces, trapped within passages that were rapidly disappearing beneath returning waves, discovered their military expertise meaningless when confronted by opponents whose weapons were cosmic rather than conventional, whose strategies operated according to principles that transcended every framework for understanding warfare between mortal armies operating within natural limitations. Bronze spear points and disciplined formations provided no defense against liquid avalanches that acknowledged no distinction between royal blood and common mortality. Chariots that had terrorized enemies across the known world vanished beneath aquatic masses whose weight exceeded any earthly substance, their wheels spinning uselessly in final moments before waters reclaimed territories that had been briefly exposed to demonstrate heavenly authority over natural boundaries that had seemed permanent until tested against powers capable of reshaping geographical features according to purposes that exceeded human comprehension of cosmic justice and celestial mercy. War horses, whose breeding represented generations of careful selection for courage and endurance, found themselves powerless against forces that operated outside every category. Their training had prepared them to confront, their magnificent strength useless when applied to circumstances where survival depended not upon speed or stamina, but upon supernatural protection that had been granted to chosen populations while being withheld from those who served earthly powers, that claimed authority over territories belonging ultimately to cosmic sovereignty. The finest warriors in Egyptian service, veterans whose skills had been proven through campaigns that extended royal authority from Nubia to the Euphrates, perished in waters that had been divided to enable liberation and reunited to complete judgment, that acknowledged no earthly rank or military achievement as sufficient qualification for survival, when divine powers rendered verdict on conflicts between heavenly and terrestrial claims to ultimate authority over populations and territories, whose fate rested ultimately with forces beyond mortal control. Royal chariots that had represented the pinnacle of military technology, their construction incorporating innovations developed through centuries of warfare against enemies equipped with the finest weapons available to human civilization, became debris scattered across ocean floor that would preserve evidence of higher intervention in historical events whose scope exceeded anything recorded in the extensive archives where scribes had documented unusual phenomena throughout the kingdom's long existence under divine kingship, that had seemed eternal until tested against cosmic powers whose nature transcended every category of earthly authority. As morning advanced toward midday, the sea that had been divided returned to its natural configuration, with no visible sign that divine engineering had temporarily altered its essential character. Only debris washing ashore provided physical testimony to events that witnesses might otherwise have dismissed as collective hallucination. Bronze fittings from royal chariots, fragments of weapons that had terrorized kingdoms, leather traces that had guided war horses, now claimed by depths that would preserve evidence of this cosmic judgment until the end of days. On the eastern shore, descendants of Abraham gathered to celebrate liberation that had been achieved not through human planning or military prowess, but through supernatural intervention that had demonstrated divine authority over forces previously thought absolute. The impossible had become reality. The trapped had become free. The slaves had become a nation, walking toward promises whose fulfillment lay hidden in desert distances that stretched toward horizons where their destiny waited to unfold, according to divine timing that acknowledged no earthly schedule. Behind them, the kingdom they had served lay broken by grief and stripped of the labor force that had sustained its prosperity for generations. Ahead lay wilderness that would test faith in ways the plagues had never demanded. Journeys that would require different kinds of divine provision. Trials that would forge identity through hardship, rather than demonstrate power through miraculous intervention. The cosmic confrontation had ended. The long education in trust was about to begin. The plague narrative that had begun with water transformed into blood would reshape human consciousness across millennia, its echoes reverberating through ages yet unborn, with power that exceeded any earthly conquest or imperial achievement. What had occurred beside the Nile's sacred waters transcended mere historical event to become template for understanding cosmic justice, divine intervention, and the eternal struggle between powers that acknowledged no earthly authority and kingdoms that claimed sovereignty over territories, belonging ultimately to forces whose nature exceeded mortal comprehension, but whose justice remained accessible to all who suffered under earthly tyranny. Passover tables in distant centuries would bear witness to this transformation, their ritual foods preserving memories that connected contemporary celebrants to ancestors who had witnessed supernatural demonstrations of divine authority over natural laws that had previously seemed absolute. The bitter herbs that recalled suffering, the unleavened bread that spoke of urgent departure, the roasted lamb that commemorated protection purchased through obedience. All would serve as tangible links between present experience and events that had established precedents for understanding how celestial powers might choose to intervene in human affairs, when earthly justice failed to protect the vulnerable from those who possessed superior force. The chronicle would spread beyond its original participants to influence peoples whose ancestors had never dwelt beside Egyptian waters, its themes resonating with universal experiences of subjugation and deliverance that transcended ethnic boundaries and cultural differences. In languages yet unspoken, voices would retell the account of higher judgment rendered against earthly powers that had forgotten their proper relationship to cosmic guidance, their words carrying forward truths about divine justice that remained relevant regardless of historical context or geographical location. Sacred meals, conducted according to traditions established during that final night in Goshen, would preserve not merely historical information, but living connection to powers that had demonstrated their capacity to transform circumstances that seemed hopeless into opportunities for liberation that exceeded human planning or military capability. The ritual questions asked by children in households scattered across continents would ensure that each new generation encountered the narrative fresh, their innocent curiosity keeping alive mysteries that philosophical sophistication might otherwise reduce to abstract theological concepts divorced from practical relevance. Songs of deliverance composed beside eastern shores, where morning light had illuminated freedom, would echo in contexts their original singers could never have imagined. Their melodies carried by voices that had learned different languages, but recognized identical themes of heavenly justice triumphing over earthly oppression through supernatural intervention that acknowledged no distinction between ancient and contemporary circumstances, when divine authority chose to manifest itself in historical events that revealed the temporary nature of all mortal power structures. The epic that recorded supernatural transformation of natural elements into instruments of divine judgment would provide vocabulary for understanding phenomena that exceeded ordinary categories of causation, its language shaping how future peoples interpreted events that challenged established assumptions about the relationship between natural law and godly authority. Terms like plague and exodus would acquire meanings that transcended their original context to describe any systematic divine intervention designed to liberate subjugated populations from powers that claimed absolute command over territories and peoples whose ultimate allegiance belonged to celestial rather than earthly sovereignty. Underground communities, preserving dangerous knowledge during periods when imperial authorities sought to suppress narratives that challenged official versions of reality, would find in this account models for understanding how divine protection might sustain populations whose survival depended upon maintaining faith in powers whose existence ruling classes denied or claimed to monopolize through religious institutions that served political rather than spiritual purposes. The tale of supernatural discrimination that protected some while judging others would offer framework for interpreting contemporary circumstances where similar patterns of divine favor and cosmic justice appeared to operate according to principles that transcended human understanding. Christian theologians, discovering in Hebrew scriptures prefigurations of their own salvation narrative, would recognize in the Lamb's blood that marked doorposts for protection the same sacrificial principle that would later find expression in different ritual forms designed to secure spiritual, rather than merely physical deliverance from forces that threatened eternal, rather than temporal destruction. The commemoration that began with unleavened bread and bitter herbs would evolve into ceremonies that maintained essential symbolic connections, while adapting to theological developments that expanded original meanings, without abandoning fundamental insights about divine protection, secured through obedient response to prophetic instruction. Revolutionary movements throughout history would find in the liberation account inspiration for understanding their own struggles against oppressive systems that claimed divine sanction for earthly tyranny, their leaders recognizing parallels between pharaonic resistance to Hebrew departure and contemporary rulers who refused to acknowledge legitimate claims for independence made by populations whose subjugation had exceeded reasonable bounds of political power. The model of supernatural intervention, supporting moral claims that lacked sufficient earthly power to achieve success through conventional means, would provide encouragement for those whose causes seemed hopeless when measured by purely human criteria. Abolitionists discovering in African American spirituals echoes of ancient themes would recognize how the narrative had crossed cultural boundaries to inspire faith among enslaved populations whose circumstances resembled those of Hebrew ancestors, dwelling in territories controlled by powers that claimed ownership over human beings whose ultimate allegiance belonged to heavenly rather than earthly authorities. Songs that spoke of rivers crossed and promised lands reached would carry forward essential insights about divine justice, operating through historical processes that exceeded the immediate circumstances that generated particular expressions of universal themes. The account would survive translation into languages whose grammatical structures reflected worldviews that had developed independently of Hebrew thought patterns, its essential meaning proving adaptable to conceptual frameworks that approached reality from different philosophical starting points, yet recognized similar patterns of cosmic justice operating through natural events that served supernatural purposes. Each linguistic rendering would contribute nuances that enriched understanding, while preserving core insights about divine authority, manifesting through interventions that transcended normal categories of historical causation. Archaeological discoveries in distant centuries would provide physical evidence supporting narrative elements that skeptics had dismissed as mythological elaboration, designed to inflate the historical significance of events that could be explained through natural causes, requiring no supernatural intervention. Inscriptions recording unusual weather patterns, administrative documents describing labor shortages, and physical remains bearing witness to sudden demographic changes would confirm the historical foundation underlying accounts whose theological significance had sometimes obscured their factual accuracy concerning events that had actually occurred in the ancient world. The template established through this celestial confrontation would shape expectations concerning how divine justice might manifest in circumstances where earthly powers exceeded reasonable bounds in exercising authority over populations whose ultimate allegiance belonged to cosmic rather than terrestrial sovereignty. Future peoples facing similar challenges would measure contemporary events against patterns established during the original demonstration of supernatural power over natural forces that had seemed absolute until tested against powers whose nature transcended every earthly category of causation and control. Across nations and eras, the structures of education would keep alive the telling as a necessary part of cultural awareness, honoring its reach into the arts of word and sound and image, and its deep impact on political thought that molded societies across centuries. Students whose religious background provided no personal connection to the account would nonetheless encounter its themes through works of art that had been inspired by images of divine judgment and liberation, their aesthetic education introducing concepts that exceeded purely artistic appreciation to include understanding of spiritual insights that had influenced human consciousness, since the events themselves had established precedents for supernatural intervention in historical circumstances. The heavenly trial that had revealed the temporary nature of earthly authority when confronted by powers whose legitimacy derived from sources beyond human institutions, would continue to influence political thought concerning the proper relationship between rulers and ruled, between temporal power and eternal justice, between human law and divine authority that served as ultimate standard for evaluating all earthly claims to sovereignty over territories and populations whose fate remained subject to cosmic purposes that transcended immediate political considerations, and while operating through historical processes that human participants could observe and interpret according to frameworks provided through revealed knowledge. Codes of law, influenced by Hebrew precedents, maintained a vision of justice that reached beyond ordinary human standards, rooted in the belief that earthly authority was provisional and answerable to cosmic oversight, an oversight capable of announcing itself through natural phenomena, enlisted in supernatural service whenever political systems failed to guard those at risk, from rulers who demanded absolute dominion over people and wealth that, in truth, remained under divine guardianship, requiring mortal rulers to act in recognition of their celestial accountability. The recollection of divine protection, won through obedience to prophetic command, became the sustaining force of faith communities, whose endurance rested not upon immediate assurances, but upon trust in powers that intervened according to rhythms beyond human calendars, their justice measured not in days or years, but across generations, fulfilling promises through causal patterns that eluded ordinary comprehension, yet revealed themselves as coherent to those whose faith could discern in single events the unfolding of universal design. In the end, the ancient catastrophe would become eternal aspiration, its themes resonating wherever human beings confronted circumstances that exceeded their capacity to achieve justice through conventional means. The songs that began beside eastern waters, where morning light had revealed the destruction of earthly power, would continue in voices yet unborn, their melodies carrying forward truths about cosmic justice that would remain relevant as long as human consciousness sought understanding of its proper relationship to powers greater than itself. What Egypt had suffered in the days of judgment remained preserved in history, not as fable, but as testimony that divine power can break into the world when institutions collapse in their duty to defend the vulnerable against the might of oppressors. In every age, the remembrance returned. Pharaoh's chariots rest at the bottom of parted waters, proof that ultimate authority lies not with earthly rulers, but with cosmic justice that intervenes on behalf of the powerless. The story endured because it spoke to eternal truths, that no human power was absolute, that divine justice operated according to timescales that exceeded mortal understanding, and that liberation could come even to those whose circumstances seemed hopeless. From the ashes of Egyptian pride to the freedom songs of distant shores, the echoes would continue, reminding each generation that the God who had once turned the Nile to blood still ruled over the affairs of nations, still heard the cries of the oppressed, still possessed the power to transform impossibility into exodus when human hearts turned toward heaven in desperate faith.